Nurse Melissa Parker froze mid-stride, the patient chart slipping from her trembling fingers and clattering to the polished hospital floor. What should have been the still body of a dying man was now moving, his fingers twitching deliberately across the white sheets. "Dr. Williams!" she screamed, her voice shattering the night shift quiet of Riverside Memorial's third floor. Two orderlies at the station dropped their coffee cups, dark liquid pooling like blood at their feet as they rushed toward room 307. Through the window behind the man's bed, the silhouette of something large and wild, something impossible, watched with amber eyes that reflected the fluorescent lights. The same creature they'd found guarding him in the forest 7 days ago. 30 years in medicine, Dr. Williams whispered, gripping the doorframe, and I've never seen anything like this. What happened in those woods was about to challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, healing, and survival. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank Miller had always been more comfortable in the wilderness than in civilization. His weathered face, mapped with lines from decades of sun and wind, told the story of a man who had lived fully in the embrace of nature. At 68, even before the stroke that imprisoned him in his own body, his tall frame had begun to bend slightly, though his blue eyes remained as sharp and alert as they had been during his 30-year career as a park ranger at Monongahela National Forest. Those who knew Frank in his prime spoke of his almost supernatural connection with wildlife. Local hunters sought his advice not just for tracking, but for understanding the creatures they pursued. "Respect what you hunt," he would say in his deep, steady voice. "They're not just targets, they're teachers." Children in the neighboring towns grew up on Ranger Frank's wilderness education programs, learning to identify bird calls and animal tracks under his patient guidance. The stroke had come without warning 2 years ago, during a routine morning hike along the trails he had helped establish. By the time George Thompson found him collapsed near Blackwater Falls, the damage was done. The diagnosis, locked-in syndrome, was as cruel as it was rare. Frank remained fully conscious, his mind intact, but virtually all voluntary muscles were paralyzed. Only his eyes could move, blinking, becoming his sole means of communication in a brutal mockery of the independence that had defined him. Elaine Miller had been a high school biology teacher before retiring to care for her husband. Their marriage of 42 years had weathered many storms, career changes, financial struggles, and the devastating loss of their only daughter, Sarah, 12 years earlier. A framed photo of Sarah still held the place of honor on their mantelpiece, a smiling young woman with her father's blue eyes and her mother's delicate features, captured mid-laugh during a family camping trip. The official report called her death a hiking accident. The truth was more complicated. The Millers' modest 2-story home on the outskirts of Harper's Ferry had slowly transformed into a makeshift medical facility. The living room now housed a hospital bed where the recliner once stood. Prescription bottles lined kitchen counters. The bathroom had been renovated with accessibility features that drained their savings. Medicare covered only a fraction of the costs. Visitors had dwindled as months stretched into years. Only George, Frank's oldest friend and former sheriff of the county, maintained his weekly visits, bringing news of the forest, reading aloud from nature magazines, and pretending not to notice the growing darkness in Elaine's eyes. What no one but Frank knew, what no one could know, was the memory he held of a wolf cub he had saved 15 years earlier. A small, frightened creature with unusual markings caught in an illegal trap near the northern boundary of his patrol area. He had freed it, treated its wounded leg, and watched it limp back to the shadows of the forest. A minor incident, never officially reported. Just another quiet moment between a man and the wilderness he had sworn to protect. The day Elaine decided to abandon Frank began like any other in their new normal. She woke at 5:30 a.m., her body trained to anticipate the alarm before it sounded. The bedroom was still dark, the early June morning holding its breath outside their window. Frank would be awake already. He slept little these days, his mind active in his immobile shell. She avoided his eyes as she moved through her morning routine, knowing they would follow her with that same piercing awareness that had once made her feel cherished, but now only intensified her guilt. "Today's the day I finally get that garden planted," she announced to the silent room, her voice artificially bright. "The tomato seedlings can't wait any longer." It was the first lie of many she would tell that day. There were no seedlings, no garden plans, only the decision that had crystallized during another sleepless night, hardening like a stone in her chest. Breakfast was mechanical. She spooned pureed oatmeal into Frank's mouth, wiped away the inevitable dribble, and spoke about neighborhood gossip he couldn't possibly care about. The Medicare nurse wouldn't arrive until noon, a 4-hour window that Elaine had carefully planned for. When she finished feeding him, she didn't immediately clean up as usual. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, finally meeting his gaze. "Remember when we first moved here? You said we'd grow old watching the sunset from the porch." Her voice cracked slightly. "You said we'd have grandchildren running around the yard by now." Frank blinked slowly, his established signal for yes. His eyes held a question. "I found another collection notice yesterday. The second mortgage isn't enough anymore." She studied her hands, thin and spotted now, veins prominent under paper-like skin. "They're threatening to put a lien on the house. Medicare denied the last 3 appeals. We're going to lose everything, Frank." Frank blinked twice. "No, or perhaps a request for more information. Dr. Maxwell says there's a care facility in Baltimore that might take you with our coverage. It's not a good place, Frank. I visited last week. The smell alone." She closed her eyes, steadying herself. "But we don't have choices anymore." What she didn't mention was Dr. Maxwell's other suggestion during their private therapy sessions that had become increasingly personal over the past year. "Sometimes the kindest act is letting go," he had said, his hand covering hers with practiced sympathy. "Frank wouldn't want this half-life for himself, and he wouldn't want this burden for you." Elaine rose abruptly, the chair scraping against linoleum. "I need to get you dressed. It's a beautiful day. We should get some fresh air before it gets too hot." Frank watched as she gathered clothes, his favorite flannel shirt, the soft one with faded green checks, and comfortable jeans rather than the usual sweatpants. Something was different today. The careful way she shaved him, the gentle application of his old cologne. Small dignities she had gradually abandoned months ago in the exhausting grind of daily care. If he could have spoken, he might have asked why. If he could have moved, he might have reached for her hand. Instead, he could only watch and wait as she maneuvered his unresisting body into his wheelchair, tucked a blanket around his legs despite the warm June morning, and packed a small bag with water bottles and his medications. "We're going for a drive," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Just like we used to." The Jeep Cherokee had been modified after his stroke, a ramp that folded out from the passenger side, special locks to secure the wheelchair. Elaine had become efficient at the loading process, though her back protested more with each passing month. Today she was especially methodical, checking each strap twice. They drove in silence away from Harper's Ferry, past the tourist areas and small businesses where they had once been regular customers. Elaine took the winding road toward the national forest, the same route they had traveled hundreds of times during their marriage, for weekend hikes, for picnics with Sarah, for Frank's daily commute during his ranger years. Frank noticed they passed the turnoff to Blackwater Falls, continuing deeper into the forest than they had ventured since his stroke. His eyes darted to Elaine's face, searching for explanation. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles whitened, but her expression remained blank, almost peaceful. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, then to the rutted dirt fire road that only Park Service vehicles typically used. The Jeep bounced and shuddered, forcing Elaine to slow their progress. The forest closed around them, dense, green, and indifferent. After nearly an hour, she pulled into a small clearing that Frank recognized immediately. Whispering Pines Outlook, a spot he had once recommended for couples seeking solitude. The irony wasn't lost on him. Elaine cut the engine. The sudden silence felt oppressive, broken only by birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. She sat motionless for long minutes, staring through the windshield at the ancient oak trees surrounding them. "I can't do this anymore, Frank," she finally said, her voice strange and distant. "The bills, the care, the emptiness. We're drowning in debt. I'm drowning in everything else." She turned to look at him directly. "You're already gone. Your body just doesn't know it yet." Frank's eyes widened, the only protest he could muster. He blinked rapidly, trying to communicate through their rudimentary system, but Elaine had already turned away, exiting the vehicle with mechanical precision. She unloaded his wheelchair with practiced movements, positioning him under the shade of a massive oak tree. From the back of the Jeep, she retrieved his thin blanket and laid it across his lap, tucking it with an almost tender gesture. "You loved these woods more than anything," she said softly. "More than me sometimes, I think." She placed his water bottle in the wheelchair's holder. "It's peaceful here, better than that facility in Baltimore." Understanding dawned in Frank's eyes as she stepped back, her meaning unmistakable. He tried desperately to make a sound, any sound, but only a faint wheeze escaped his throat. Elaine flinched at the noise. "Don't, Frank. Please don't make this harder." Tears streaked her face now, but her voice had hardened. "I left your afternoon medications in the pouch. It won't take long." She took a deep, shuddering breath and leaned forward, pressing her lips to his forehead in a gesture so familiar it made his heart ache despite everything. "Goodbye, Frank. I did love you. I'm sorry it ended this way." Without looking back, she returned to the Jeep, started the engine, and slowly backed away. The last glimpse Frank had of his wife of 42 years was her pale profile framed in the driver's window, jaw set in determination or despair. He couldn't tell which. The sound of the engine faded, leaving him alone with the indifferent chorus of the forest. His heart hammered in his chest, the only part of him that could still express the panic flooding his system. Afternoon shadows lengthened across the clearing as reality settled over him. No one knew where he was. The nurse would discover his absence, but Elaine would have a story prepared. Perhaps he had died peacefully. Perhaps they had decided on cremation. Who would question her grief? As daylight began to fade, the forest changed. Daytime birds quieted, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl. Insects crescendoed their nightly symphony. The temperature dropped subtly, dew beginning to form on the grass around his wheels. Frank had taught wilderness survival for decades, but had never felt so utterly helpless in the face of nature's indifference. His ranger training cataloged his situation with clinical detachment. Without water, he had perhaps 3 days. Exposure would likely claim him before dehydration if the night temperatures dropped significantly. Predators were a consideration, though attacks on humans were rare. His mind, still sharp despite his body's betrayal, calculated his chances at near zero. As darkness fell completely, he heard the first howl in the distance, the long, mournful call of a wolf echoing through the trees. It was answered by another, further away. The sounds were familiar to Frank, though wolf packs had only recently begun to reestablish themselves in these forests after decades of absence. In his ranger days, he had advocated for their protection, arguing passionately against local farmers' concerns. The irony was bitter. He had spent his life protecting the wilderness, and now it would claim him. The night grew darker. Stars appeared between the branches overhead. The Milky Way, a brilliant swath across the black canvas. It was beautiful, he had to admit. If this was to be his end, at least it was under an open sky rather than the popcorn ceiling of the living room where he had spent the last 2 years. A rustling in the underbrush snapped him from his thoughts. Something was approaching, something large enough to disturb the ground cover. Frank tensed internally, though his body remained motionless. A deer, perhaps, or a black bear looking for easy forage. His exposed position left him completely vulnerable. From the darkness at the edge of the clearing, a shape emerged, low to the ground, moving with fluid grace. The moonlight caught its form, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of a wolf. Large, with thick gray fur silvered by the moonlight, it approached cautiously, head low, yellow eyes fixed on the strange object under the oak tree. Frank's breath caught in his throat. The wolf was magnificent, a male, he guessed, in his prime. As it drew closer, Frank could see a distinctive marking, a slash of white fur over its right eye, bisected by what appeared to be an old scar. The wolf circled the wheelchair once, twice, sniffing curiously. Frank remained perfectly still, not that he had any choice. Predators were triggered by movement, by the chase. Though in his case no chase would be necessary. To his surprise, the wolf showed no aggression. It approached carefully, stretched its muzzle forward, and sniffed Frank's dangling hand. The warm breath against his skin was shockingly intimate. The wolf continued its investigation, smelling his clothes, his shoes, his face. Frank knew he should be terrified, but instead found himself fascinated by the creature's methodical exploration. After completing its inspection, the wolf sat on its haunches directly in front of Frank's wheelchair, studying him with an intelligence that seemed almost unnatural. Its head tilted slightly to one side, yellow eyes reflecting the moonlight. And then, to Frank's astonishment, the wolf did something entirely unexpected. It stood, circled behind the wheelchair, and lay down pressed against the rear wheels, its warm body just touching Frank's legs through the thin blanket. As the night deepened and the forest temperature dropped further, the wolf remained, its body heat a small but significant barrier against the encroaching cold. Frank, who had resigned himself to death, found himself clinging to a fragile, impossible hope as the stars wheeled overhead and his unlikely guardian kept silent vigil beside him. The first pink streaks of dawn filtered through the oak canopy when Frank awakened from his fitful doze. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. The unfamiliar angle of light, the damp smell of earth instead of antiseptic, the absence of mechanical beeping that had become the soundtrack of his existence. Then reality crashed back. Elaine, the forest, abandonment, and the wolf. Frank's eyes darted downward, expecting to find himself alone. Instead, the gray wolf remained, now sitting alert beside the wheelchair, amber eyes scanning the tree line. When it sensed Frank's consciousness returning, it turned to regard him with that same unnerving intelligence. In the clear morning light, Frank could better see the distinctive scar cutting through the white patch over its right eye, an old injury long healed. Something about that marking tugged at Frank's memory. The angle of the scar, the way it interrupted the natural pattern of the fur. He had seen it before. Or something very like it. The forest stirred around them as daylight strengthened. Birds resumed their territorial songs, small creatures rustled in the underbrush, and the occasional breeze stirred the oak's massive branches overhead. Frank's parched throat reminded him painfully of his predicament. The water bottle Elaine had left was secured in the chair's holder, but he had no way to reach it, no way to uncap it. Thirst would claim him long before starvation. As if sensing his distress, the wolf stood and approached the chair. It sniffed at the water bottle, nudging it with its nose. Frank watched, fascinated despite his situation, as the animal seemed to assess the problem. After a moment, the wolf gripped the bottle with its teeth and pulled, popping it free from the holder. The plastic crackled as powerful jaws closed around it. Frank expected the water to simply spill onto the ground, wasted. Instead, the wolf lay down directly in front of the wheelchair and began working at the cap with surprising dexterity, paws holding the bottle steady as teeth worried at the plastic top. Water leaked from the punctured container, pooling on a flat rock below. The wolf looked up at Frank, then down at the small puddle of water, then back at Frank again. The message seemed clear, impossible as it was. Frank's mind raced. Could he somehow bend forward? His neck muscles retained minimal function, not enough to drink normally, but perhaps enough to reach that life-giving puddle if he could just... He concentrated with all his will, feeling sweat bead on his forehead with the effort. His head moved forward a bare inch, then another. The strain was immense, muscles atrophied from disuse, screaming in protest. The wolf watched intently as Frank struggled. When his strength gave out and his head fell back against the chair, the animal made a soft, whining sound. It stood, considering the situation, then did something remarkable. It dipped its muzzle into the small puddle, soaking its fur, then rose and placed its wet snout directly against Frank's parched lips. The moisture was minimal, but to Frank it was a revelation. Cool, blessed wetness against his cracked lips. The wolf repeated this action several times, each time returning to offer what little water it could transfer. It was barely enough to moisten his mouth, nowhere near enough to sustain life, but the intention behind the act was unmistakable. As the sun climbed higher, Frank's mind drifted back 15 years to a cold October morning when he had been inspecting the northern perimeter of his ranger district. He had discovered an illegal trap, a cruel, toothed device that had been banned for decades. Caught in its merciless grip was a young wolf cub, no more than 6 months old, with distinctive white markings on its face. The memory crystallized. The cub's terror as he approached, its futile attempts to flee despite the trap's grip on its foreleg, the surprising lack of aggression as he worked to release the mechanism. He had expected it to bolt or snap once freed, but instead it had remained long enough for him to apply antiseptic to the wound, a deep gash that would certainly leave a scar. Its eyes, amber even then, had held his for a long moment before it limped away into the underbrush. Could this possibly be the same wolf? The timing was wrong. Wolves in the wild rarely lived beyond 10 years. But the marking, the scar, perhaps a descendant. The coincidence seemed too great, yet no more incredible than its current behavior. His ranger's knowledge catalogued the facts. Wolves were highly intelligent social animals with complex family structures. They recognized and remembered individuals, both wolf and human. They passed knowledge through generations. Most importantly, contrary to their fearsome reputation, unprovoked attacks on humans were vanishingly rare. Still, what was happening defied easy explanation. The wolf was actively trying to help him. As the day progressed, this became increasingly clear. It brought him a fallen apple from a wild tree nearby, placing it carefully in his lap. When Frank couldn't grasp it, the wolf nudged it closer to his hand until his fingers weakly closed around it. The small victory, his first voluntary movement in 2 years, sent a shock through Frank's system. By midday, Frank's situation had improved marginally, but remained dire. The wolf's efforts had provided minimal hydration and the apple's moisture, but exposure remained a serious threat. The June day was warm, but nights in the forest could still drop to dangerous temperatures for someone immobile. The wolf seemed to understand this as well. Throughout the afternoon, it brought dry leaves and pine needles, creating a rough nest around the base of the wheelchair. Frank watched in astonishment as it systematically gathered insulating materials, occasionally stopping to check on him as if ensuring he remained alive. As evening approached again, Frank's thoughts turned to Elaine. She would have returned home by now. What story had she told the visiting nurse? What explanation had she given George, who was scheduled for his weekly visit tomorrow? Had she reported him missing, creating a false timeline, or claimed he had died peacefully at home, his body already cremated? The possibilities sickened him. Not for the betrayal itself. In his darkest moments of the past 2 years, he had contemplated the mercy of death, but for what it revealed about the woman he had loved for over 4 decades. How desperate, how broken must she be to leave him here? The financial strain had been immense, yes. The caregiver burden unrelenting. But his ruminations were interrupted by a sharp bark. The wolf stood at attention, ears forward, body tense. It growled low in its throat, eyes fixed on something beyond Frank's field of vision. A moment later, Frank heard what had alerted his companion: the distinctive snuffling and heavy footfalls of a black bear. Frank's pulse quickened. Black bears weren't typically aggressive toward humans, but they were opportunistic feeders and could be unpredictable. An immobile human would present an unusual situation, not prey, but not a threat either. The bear emerged into the clearing, a medium-sized male, probably just over 200 pounds. It stood on its hind legs upon noticing the wheelchair and its occupant, nose working to process the unfamiliar scents. The wolf immediately positioned itself between Frank and the newcomer, hackles raised, teeth bared in unmistakable warning. The size disparity was significant. The bear outweighed the wolf by at least 3 to 1, yet the wolf showed no hesitation. It growled again, deeper and more threatening, taking a deliberate step forward. The bear dropped to all fours, seemingly confused by this unexpected confrontation. It sidestepped, trying to circle around, perhaps to investigate the strange human object from another angle. The wolf matched its movements precisely, maintaining the protective position. This standoff continued for several minutes, a careful dance of dominance and territory. Frank could only watch, heart pounding, as his unlikely guardian faced down a creature that could kill it with a single blow. Finally, the bear seemed to lose interest. With a dismissive huff, it turned and ambled back into the forest, occasionally looking over its shoulder as if reconsidering. Only when it had completely disappeared did the wolf relax its stance, returning to Frank's side with a soft whine. "Thank you," Frank thought, wishing desperately he could speak the words aloud. As if understanding, the wolf pressed its warm body against his legs and settled in for another night of vigilance. Miles away in Harper's Ferry, George Thompson pulled into the miller's driveway for his weekly visit. He carried his usual offerings: a 6-pack of Frank's favorite local beer, which George would drink while describing the taste to his friend, the latest issue of National Geographic, and freshly baked cornbread from his wife's kitchen. The house looked different somehow, quieter. The curtains drawn despite the beautiful afternoon. No wheelchair ramp deployed at the side door where Elaine usually had Frank sitting on pleasant days. George's knock went unanswered for long enough that he was about to try calling Elaine's cell phone when the door finally opened. Elaine stood before him, eyes red-rimmed, hair uncharacteristically disheveled. She wore the same clothes he had seen her in 3 days earlier at the grocery store. "George," she said flatly, "I forgot you were coming today." "Everything okay, Elaine? Where's Frank?" George peered past her into the darkened house. She pressed her lips together, shoulders slumping. "He's gone, George. Yesterday morning. In his sleep." Her voice broke on the last word, a sob escaping that sounded genuine enough. George stood frozen, the six-pack dangling forgotten from his fingers. "What? No. I was just here last week. He seemed—" He stopped, realizing the absurdity of saying Frank had seemed anything. Frank's condition hadn't changed in months. "It was peaceful," Elaine continued, not meeting his eyes. "The hospice nurse said it happens that way sometimes. 1 minute breathing, the next." She gestured vaguely. "Why didn't you call me?" George asked, hurt mixing with the shock. "I would have. There should be a service. People would want to say goodbye. I had him cremated yesterday. It's what he wanted." She finally looked up, something challenging in her gaze. "Just a simple goodbye, no fuss. You know Frank." George did know Frank, which was why alarm bells were now ringing in his mind. Frank, who had left detailed instructions for everything from how to maintain his boat engine to where the Christmas decorations were stored, had never once mentioned wanting cremation. In fact, George distinctly remembered him saying he wanted to be buried in the cemetery plot he'd purchased beside Sarah's grave. "Can I come in for a minute?" George asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I'd like to, I don't know, maybe say a few words. Have a beer in his honor." Elaine hesitated, then stepped back. "Of course. Sorry, I'm not thinking straight." The house felt wrong the moment George entered. Frank's hospital bed remained in the living room, but it was stripped bare, the sheets and Frank's special pillows nowhere in sight. The medication organizer that normally sat on the side table was missing. Most tellingly, the small whiteboard they used to track Frank's schedule and medications had been wiped clean. "It happened so fast," Elaine was saying, moving nervously around the kitchen. "The funeral home was very accommodating. I didn't want to wait." George nodded, watching her closely. In 40 years of law enforcement before his retirement, he had developed a finely tuned sense for deception. Everything about Elaine's behavior screamed dishonesty. The way she avoided eye contact, her excessive explanations, the unusual haste of the cremation. "Where's the urn?" he asked suddenly. Elaine froze. "What?" "Frank's ashes. Where are they?" She gestured vaguely toward the mantel. "I haven't picked them up yet." "They said it takes a few days for the processing." George nodded again, though he knew from his own wife's passing that cremated remains were typically ready within hours, not days. "I see. Well, when you get them, I'd like to be there when you scatter them. Frank and I talked about his favorite spot in the national forest." "Of course," Elaine said quickly. Too quickly. "I'll let you know." George stayed only 15 minutes more, making awkward small talk while his mind raced. When he finally left, promising to check on her again soon, he sat in his truck for a long moment, staring at the house. Something was very wrong. Frank wasn't dead, or if he was, he hadn't died as Elaine described. But what had happened? And why would she lie? George started his engine, a plan already forming. His first stop would be the county funeral homes to verify Elaine's cremation story. His second would be the sheriff's office, where his nephew now wore the badge George had surrendered 5 years ago. If Frank was missing, every hour counted. As night fell over the forest for the second time, Frank's awareness began to blur at the edges. Dehydration was taking its toll despite the wolf's efforts. His thoughts wandered to Sarah, to the camping trips they had taken in this very forest, to the painful months after her death, when the woods had been his only solace. The wolf remained vigilant beside him, occasionally rising to patrol the perimeter of their small clearing before returning to press its warm body against his legs. In his increasingly delirious state, Frank imagined he could communicate with the creature, explaining his situation, thanking it for its inexplicable kindness. "You should go," he thought toward the wolf. "Find your pack. I'm not going to make it." As if in response, the wolf raised its head and looked directly into Frank's eyes. In that gaze, Frank saw something that transcended the barrier between species, a determination, a purpose, a refusal to abandon what it had decided to protect. In that moment, with stars appearing once more through the oak branches above, Frank found himself clinging to life with renewed purpose. Someone had to know this story. Someone had to understand what this wild creature had done. Even if he died here, he would fight to last one more day, and then another, on the slim chance that he might be found, not for himself, but so the wolf's extraordinary behavior would not go unwitnessed. The third day dawned with a gentle misting rain that clung to the forest canopy before dripping in sporadic, heavy drops onto the clearing below. Frank drifted in and out of consciousness, his body weakening from dehydration despite the wolf's persistent efforts. During his lucid moments, he catalogued his symptoms with the detached precision of his ranger training: increased heart rate, severe thirst, dizziness even while immobile, and the dangerous absence of urination for nearly 24 hours. Without intervention, kidney failure would soon follow. The wolf seemed to sense his deterioration. It became more agitated, pacing the clearing before disappearing into the undergrowth for longer periods. Each time Frank feared it had finally abandoned him, it would return, sometimes with its muzzle wet from a nearby stream, sometimes carrying small forest offerings. Once it brought a freshly caught rabbit, laying the untouched prey at Frank's feet in what seemed like frustrated desperation when he couldn't respond. During one of the wolf's absences, Frank's mind wandered to Sarah. Not to her death, which had dominated his thoughts for years, but to her life, specifically a camping trip when she was 12. They had been hiking when sudden thunderstorms forced them to shelter under an outcropping. As they waited out the deluge, Sarah had peppered him with questions about forest survival. "What if we got separated?" she had asked, eyes wide with the delicious fear of a child contemplating danger from a place of safety. "How would I find you? How would you find me?" "I'd never stop looking," he had promised. "Not for 1 minute of one day." Frank had taught her the basics that afternoon: how to follow flowing water downstream, how to create signals visible from above, how to read the forest's subtle navigation cues. Sarah had absorbed it all with the solemn attention that characterized her approach to everything, from schoolwork to her beloved photography. The memory shifted to the last photos she had taken before her death, haunting black and white landscapes captured during her solitary hikes. One image in particular had always disturbed him: a twisted tree photographed from below, its branches forming what looked like desperate, reaching arms against an empty sky. She had titled it "Abandoned." 2 weeks later, she was gone. A cold drop of rain splashed against Frank's cheek, jolting him back to the present. The wolf had returned and was attempting to shelter him, positioning its body to block the intermittent rainfall. Frank blinked slowly in gratitude, wondering if these quiet exchanges with a wild animal would be his last communication on Earth. As the morning progressed, the drizzle intensified into steady rain. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Frank began to shiver, an involuntary response his damaged nervous system still permitted. The wolf pressed closer, its fur dampening as it tried to share its warmth. In a parallel sequence unfolding 20 miles away, George Thompson stood in the office of Sheriff Mike Brennan, his nephew and successor, laying out his concerns. "None of the funeral homes in the county have any record of Frank Miller," George concluded, tapping a notepad where he'd recorded his calls. "Elaine said he died Tuesday morning and was cremated that same day. That's not just unlikely, Mike. It's impossible." Sheriff Brennan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. At 38, he had the same solid build as his uncle, but lacked the weathered experience. Still, he had learned to trust George's instincts. "You think she's lying about his death entirely?" "That's a pretty serious accusation against a grieving widow, Uncle George." "I've known Frank and Elaine for 40 years, George replied. "Something's off. Frank's condition was stable. The house felt wrong. And Elaine—" He hesitated, reluctant to voice his darkest suspicion. "She's been different lately. Distant. The caregiver burden was crushing her." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Caregiver fatigue is real. I've seen cases where it led to neglect, but she told me once that she sometimes thought about driving away and never coming back." George interrupted. "I thought she was just venting. Now I'm not so sure." Mike straightened, his expression shifting from skeptical to concerned. "Okay, let's approach this systematically. If Frank isn't dead, where is he? Hospital records?" "Already checked. No admissions under his name in any facility within 50 miles. "And no one else has reported him missing?" "The visiting nurse was scheduled for noon Tuesday." "Elaine told her Frank had passed and canceled future visits. No red flags there." The sheriff tapped his pen against the desktop, thinking. "What about Frank's medications? He needed those daily, right?" George's eyes widened. "The prescription bottles were gone from the house. If she—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavily between them. If Elaine had taken Frank somewhere without his medications, his condition would deteriorate rapidly. "I'm going to need to question Elaine," Mike said, standing. "But first, let me see if there's any unusual activity on their credit cards or bank accounts. If she transported him somewhere, there might be a trail." While the sheriff made calls, George stared at the wall map of Jefferson County, his mind working through possibilities. Where would Elaine take Frank if she wanted to ensure he wouldn't be found? The answer hit him with sickening clarity. The one place Frank had always loved most, where his absence would be attributed to nature rather than human cruelty. "The National Forest," he said aloud, just as Mike returned. "You might be on to something," the sheriff replied. "Elaine's credit card was used at Walker's gas station on Route 16 Tuesday morning. That's the last stop before the Northern Forest access road." George felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "She took him into the woods, Mike. We need to organize a search party immediately." "On what grounds?" "We have no proof Frank is missing or in danger. Elaine hasn't filed a report, and we can't officially declare him missing based on your suspicions alone." "Then we do it unofficially," George insisted. "I can get a dozen men together in an hour. Guys who know Frank who'd want to help." Mike hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Okay. Unofficial search party. But I'm coming with you, and if we find nothing by sundown, we do this by the book, which means questioning Elaine directly." "Deal," George agreed, already reaching for his phone. By early afternoon, 8 vehicles packed with volunteers assembled at the Walker's gas station parking lot. The group included former rangers who had worked with Frank, members of the local hunting club, and 3 wilderness EMTs who had brought medical supplies just in case. George had been strategic in his calls, selecting people who knew the forest and could keep the operation quiet. "We focus on areas Frank favored," George instructed as they gathered around a spread-out map. "Places with significance to him: Blackwater Falls, Whispering Pines Outlook, the old fire tower. Mike's team will take the main access roads. The rest of us will split up and cover these connecting trails." He pointed to a series of paths marked in red. "If you find anything at all, use the radio. Cell reception is spotty at best out there." "What exactly are we looking for?" asked Bill Harmon, a retired biology teacher who had often accompanied Frank on bird-watching expeditions. "Tire tracks? Footprints?" George exchanged a glance with Mike before answering. "Frank's wheelchair, or any sign of recent vehicle activity in restricted areas." The implications silenced the group momentarily. Then Mike stepped forward, his uniform lending official gravity to the situation. "We keep this quiet for now. No sirens, no lights. If Frank is out there—" He left the sentence unfinished. "Let's move out. Daylight's burning, and rain's in the forecast." As the search parties dispersed, George climbed into his truck with Bill and headed toward Whispering Pines Outlook. A nagging certainty told him Frank was there. It had been a special place for the Millers, the site of countless anniversaries and quiet retreats. If Elaine had wanted Frank's final moments to have any dignity, she would have chosen somewhere meaningful. Back in the forest clearing, Frank's condition had deteriorated further. The steady rain had soaked through his clothing despite the wolf's attempts to shield him. His body temperature was dropping dangerously, and the persistent moisture had begun to raise concerns about pneumonia, a virtual death sentence in his weakened state. The wolf seemed increasingly distressed. It would leave briefly, then return to check on him, whining softly as if encouraging him to respond. During one such absence, Frank's thoughts drifted to Elaine again, trying to understand how they had reached this point. He remembered her face on their wedding day, so full of hope and determination. The way she had supported his career choice despite the modest salary and irregular hours. Her quiet strength when they received the devastating news that Sarah would be their only child due to complications during the birth. The passionate science teacher who had inspired generations of students who had once told him, "I teach because I believe in tomorrow." When had that belief in tomorrow died? Was it after Sarah's death? Or more recently, as their savings evaporated into medical bills and their future narrowed to an endless cycle of care and dependence? Frank couldn't hate her, even now. In his most honest moments, he had contemplated the same solution during the darkest hours of his imprisonment within his own body. The difference was that he had never acted on that despair, had never imposed that final decision on another. The wolf's return interrupted his thoughts. It approached with purposeful energy, nudging his hand insistently, then backing away several steps before returning to repeat the gesture. After several repetitions of this behavior, Frank realized it wanted him to follow, an impossible request. Suddenly the wolf's ears pricked forward. It froze, listening intently to something beyond Frank's hearing range. A low growl rumbled in its throat, but unlike its reaction to the bear, this sound seemed cautious rather than threatening. Minutes later, Frank heard it too, the distant sound of human voices, faint but unmistakable. The wolf retreated to the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by undergrowth but still vigilant. Its amber eyes remained fixed on Frank, as if reluctant to leave its self-appointed charge. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive crackle of radio communication. Frank's heart surged with desperate hope. He tried to make a sound, any sound, but produced only the faintest wheeze, not enough to be heard over the gentle patter of rain and the searcher's own conversation. The wolf watched the tree line intensely as the sounds approached. Then, in a decision that seemed to defy all natural instinct, it threw back its head and howled, a long, piercing call that echoed through the forest canopy. The human voices stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" A man's voice, closer now. "Wolf," came the reply. "Pretty close, too." "There aren't supposed to be any wolves in this sector," a third voice added. "Conservation's been tracking the packs further north." Frank recognized that voice with a surge of emotion. George. His oldest friend was looking for him. The wolf howled again, then darted forward to Frank's wheelchair before retreating to the forest edge, a deliberate movement that seemed calculated to draw attention. "It's coming from the Outlook clearing," George's voice called. Through those pines, Frank heard the sounds of people moving through underbrush, branches snapping under hurried footsteps. The wolf howled a third time, then fell silent, watching intently from its position. The moment George emerged into the clearing and saw the wheelchair, his face transformed through shock, horror, and finally overwhelming relief. "Frank! Oh my God, Frank!" He sprinted forward, dropping to his knees beside the chair. Behind him, two other searchers appeared, their expressions mirroring his initial shock. "He's alive!" George shouted, fingers pressed to Frank's neck. "Get the EMTs up here now, and blankets, he's freezing!" As the other men scrambled to relay the message on their radios, George gripped Frank's cold hand. "We found you, old friend. We found you." His voice broke as he wrapped his jacket around Frank's shoulders. "Just hold on a little longer." Frank's eyes moved to the forest edge where the wolf still watched. George followed his gaze and stiffened. "Jesus," he whispered, spotting the large predator. "Don't move, Frank." "There's a wolf." Frank blinked deliberately, trying to communicate. To his surprise, George seemed to understand. It's not threatening you?" he asked incredulously. Frank blinked once for yes. George stared at the wolf, then back at Frank. "Has it been here with you? The whole time?" Another deliberate blink. George's expression transformed yet again, this time to wonder. "Incredible," he murmured. Then, raising his voice slightly, he addressed the wolf directly. "Thank you for watching over him. We'll take care of him now." The wolf regarded him steadily for a long moment before melting silently back into the forest, just as the first EMT burst into the clearing. What followed was a blur of urgent activity. The medical team worked quickly, wrapping Frank in thermal blankets, starting an IV for fluids and emergency medications, assessing his condition with professional efficiency. Their initial prognosis was guarded but hopeful: severe dehydration, early hypothermia, and concerning but not yet life-threatening renal values. "He's a fighter," the lead EMT told George as they secured Frank to a portable stretcher. "Most people wouldn't have survived 2 days out here in his condition, let alone 3. The extraction was challenging. The clearing's location required them to carry Frank nearly a mile to the nearest access point where vehicles could reach. 6 men took turns with the stretcher, navigating carefully through the wet, uneven terrain. Throughout the journey, Frank drifted between consciousness and a dreamlike state where past and present blurred. He thought he glimpsed flashes of gray moving parallel to their path, the wolf following at a distance. Whether reality or hallucination, the image comforted him. By the time they reached the ambulance, a small crowd had gathered, the remainder of the search party all watching with solemn faces as Frank was loaded inside. George climbed in beside him, refusing to be separated. "We're taking him to Riverside Memorial," the EMT informed the sheriff. "It's further, but they have the best renal specialists." Mike nodded, then turned to George. "I'll handle Elaine. You stay with Frank." As the ambulance doors closed, Frank caught a final glimpse of the forest edge. There, just visible in the gathering dusk, stood the wolf, a silent sentinel marking his departure from the wilderness that had both threatened his life and somehow preserved it. The journey to Riverside Memorial passed in a haze of siren wails and George's constant reassurances. Frank understood he had been found, that help had arrived, but the miraculous nature of his rescue hadn't fully registered. His mind kept returning to the wolf, its intelligence, its seemingly impossible compassion, the way it had defied its own nature to protect a helpless human. Upon arrival at the hospital, Frank was immediately surrounded by medical personnel. Their voices overlapped in a cacophony of urgent instructions. Get a central line in him. Severe dehydration, possible renal compromise. Core temperature still below normal. Need a full neurological workup. They whisked him away from George, through double doors and into the bright antiseptic world of emergency medicine. As they transferred him to a hospital bed, one young doctor leaned close. "Mr. Miller, you're safe now. We're going to take good care of you. Can you understand me?" Frank blinked once, deliberately. The doctor's eyes widened slightly. You can communicate? That's excellent. He turned to a nurse. Note that patient is responsive and understands verbal communication. 1 blink for yes, 2 for no. For the first time in 3 days, really, for the first time in 2 years, Frank felt truly seen. Not as a burden, not as a shell, but as a person with thoughts and feelings worthy of attention. Hours later, stabilized and settled in the ICU, Frank was finally allowed visitors. George entered hesitantly, his weathered face haggard with exhaustion, but brightening when he saw Frank awake. "There he is," George said, pulling a chair close to the bed. "You gave us quite a scare, old friend." Frank blinked once, his gaze questioning. "Elaine?" George interpreted correctly, his expression darkening. "She's been taken in for questioning. Mike went to the house after we found you." He paused, clearly weighing how much to share. "She confessed immediately, Frank. Said she couldn't handle it anymore. The care, the bills, watching you suffer. She planned to tell everyone you died peacefully at home." Frank closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this confirmation of his wife's betrayal. "I'm so sorry," George continued. "I should have seen it coming. She'd been different lately, more withdrawn, but I never thought." He trailed off, shaking his head. When Frank opened his eyes again, George leaned forward, changing the subject. "The doctors say you're stabilizing nicely. Your kidneys are responding to treatment, and your core temperature is almost normal." He hesitated, then added with bewilderment, "They're actually a bit mystified about your condition. You should be in much worse shape after 3 days without proper hydration or medication." Frank's gaze drifted toward the window, remembering the wolf's determined efforts to provide water, to keep him warm. "About that wolf," George said, following his glance. "The Park Service is going crazy over your guardian angel. The rangers have never documented that kind of behavior before. They want to interview you when you're stronger, if you're willing." Frank blinked once, emphatically. "I thought so," George smiled. Always the naturalist. His expression grew serious again. "I have to ask, though, did you recognize it? The wolf, I mean. It seemed, I don't know, almost like it knew you." Frank's mind flashed to the distinctive scar, the white patch of fur. He blinked once, then twice in rapid succession, trying to convey the complexity of his answer. George frowned slightly. "Yes and no? You're not sure?" Another single blink. "Well, it's a mystery for another day," George conceded, patting Frank's hand. "Right now, you need to rest and recover." As night fell over the hospital, Frank lay awake, his thoughts churning despite the sedatives in his system. The medical staff had explained that he would remain in the ICU for at least 48 hours while they monitored his kidney function and addressed his other medical needs. Beyond that, his future remained uncertain. Where would he go when discharged? Not home, not to the house he had shared with Elaine, now tainted by her final betrayal. Some kind of care facility seemed inevitable given his condition, a prospect he had always dreaded. His gaze turned to the window, where darkness had transformed the glass into a mirror reflecting the sterile hospital room. For a moment he imagined he could see beyond it to the distant forest, to the clearing where his life had nearly ended, and where, paradoxically, he had felt more truly alive than he had in the 2 years since his stroke. In the quiet beeping of monitors and the soft footfalls of night nurses, Frank made a silent promise to himself. Somehow, he would find a way to tell the wolf's story. Even locked within his paralyzed body, he would make sure the world understood what had happened in those woods. The extraordinary compassion of a wild creature that had chosen protection over predation, companionship over instinct. It was his last conscious thought before exhaustion finally claimed him, drawing him into the first truly peaceful sleep he had experienced in years. Frank awoke to sunlight streaming through the hospital window and the sound of hushed, urgent voices just outside his door. The clarity of his mind surprised him. The fog of dehydration and exposure had lifted, replaced by a sharp awareness of his surroundings. His body remained largely immobile, of course, but something felt different. A tingling sensation in his fingertips that hadn't been there before. A subtle warmth in limbs that had been cold and unresponsive for 2 years. The door opened, admitting Dr. James Williams, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and the focused intensity of someone perpetually short on time. Behind him followed a younger doctor and 2 nurses, all wearing expressions that fluctuated between professional detachment and poorly concealed excitement. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Dr. Williams said, approaching the bed. "I'm Dr. Williams, Chief of Neurology. How are you feeling today?" Frank blinked once for yes, the communication system now familiar to the hospital staff. "Excellent. Your vital signs have stabilized remarkably overnight. Kidney function is returning to baseline, and your blood work shows significant improvement." The doctor paused, studying Frank's face. "However, we've noticed something unusual in your latest scans that I'd like to discuss with you." He motioned to a nurse who positioned a tablet where Frank could see it. On the screen were 2 brain scans labeled simply "Previous" and "Current." "This first image is from your records at Harper's Ferry Medical Center, taken 6 months ago," Dr. Williams explained. "It shows the damage from your stroke, specifically the lesions in your brain stem that resulted in your locked-in syndrome." Frank had seen similar images before during the endless series of appointments that followed his stroke. The dark areas representing dead neural tissue, the sentence of permanent paralysis rendered in grayscale. "This second image," the doctor continued, "was taken last night after your admission." He pointed to subtle differences between the 2 scans. "What's remarkable is that we're seeing signs of neural regeneration in areas previously thought to be permanently damaged. It's minimal, but it's there, and it shouldn't be possible." Frank stared at the images, trying to process the implications. The medical team watched him closely, perhaps expecting shock or disbelief. Instead, Frank felt a strange sense of validation. Something had changed in the forest. He had felt it. "Mr. Miller, I'd like to conduct a simple test, if you don't mind." Dr. Williams moved to the foot of the bed and folded back the blanket to expose Frank's feet. "I'm going to touch your foot. I don't expect you to be able to move it, but I want you to try to focus on the sensation." The doctor ran a metal instrument along the sole of Frank's right foot. Under normal circumstances, this would trigger an involuntary plantar reflex. In Frank's case, there had been no response to such tests since his stroke. "Try to concentrate on moving your toes," Dr. Williams instructed. Frank focused with all his will, imagining the movement, picturing his toes curling downward. For almost 2 minutes, nothing happened. The medical team waited patiently, exchanging glances as the seconds ticked by. Then, almost imperceptibly, Frank's big toe twitched. The movement was tiny, just millimeters, but undeniable. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. "Again," Dr. Williams said quietly, his professional demeanor slipping to reveal raw scientific curiosity. "Try once more, Mr. Miller." Frank concentrated harder, channeling all his mental energy into that single toe. This time the movement came more quickly, a definite downward curl followed by a faint motion in the second toe. "My God," whispered the younger doctor, "that's not supposed to be possible." Dr. Williams straightened, his expression a complex mixture of excitement and caution. "Mr. Miller, what we're seeing is extremely unusual. Neural regeneration of this nature, especially after a prolonged period of paralysis, defies conventional medical understanding." Frank blinked once, acknowledging the explanation while wishing he could express more. "I'd like to run more comprehensive tests," the doctor continued. "With your permission, we'll bring in specialists from our rehabilitation department to fully assess what movement capabilities might be returning." Another blink of agreement. "In the meantime," Dr. Williams added, "I understand you had an unusual companion during your time in the forest. A wolf, according to your friend Mr. Thompson. The Park Service is quite interested in this aspect of your experience." Frank's eyes widened slightly, his gaze darting to the window and back. "Don't worry," the doctor assured him, misinterpreting his concern. "You're perfectly safe here. But there have been some unusual reports from our security team overnight. Apparently, a large canine was spotted near the hospital grounds. The description matches what Mr. Thompson reported." Frank wasn't surprised. Somehow, he had sensed the wolf's presence, a connection that transcended normal understanding. He blinked once, confirming his interest. "A wildlife biologist from the Park Service would like to speak with you once you're feeling stronger," Dr. Williams said. "Would that be acceptable?" Another affirmative blink. "Excellent. For now, rest and let the rehabilitation team do their assessment when they arrive." The doctor made a few notes in Frank's chart before addressing him directly again. "Mr. Miller, I don't want to give you false hope, but what we're seeing is promising. Whatever happened in that forest, your survival against the odds, these unexpected neurological changes, it's something we need to understand better." After the medical team departed, Frank was left alone with his thoughts and the persistent tingling in his extremities. He focused on his right hand, attempting to channel the same mental energy that had moved his toes. For several frustrating minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to give up, his index finger twitched, a barely perceptible movement, but one he controlled. The victory, small as it was, brought tears to his eyes. For 2 years, he had been a passenger in his own body, unable to perform even the most basic functions independently. This tiny movement represented something profound. Possibility. He was still exploring this newfound connection to his body when George arrived, carrying a duffel bag and wearing the same clothes as the previous day. Clearly, he hadn't gone home. "Morning, Frank," George greeted, setting down the bag. "Brought you some of your things from the house. Thought you might want your own pajamas instead of that hospital gown." He gestured vaguely at the thin fabric barely covering Frank's dignity. Frank blinked his thanks, then deliberately moved his gaze to his right hand and back to George's face. "What is it?" George asked, leaning closer. "Your hand. Is something wrong?" With intense concentration, Frank managed to twitch his index finger again. The movement was stronger this time, more definite. George stared, disbelief giving way to astonishment. "Frank, did you just... Can you do that again?" Frank obliged, the second attempt coming easier than the first. That's incredible!" George exclaimed, grabbing Frank's shoulder gently. "The doctor said you were showing unusual signs, but I didn't expect..." He broke off, emotion overtaking him. "This is huge, Frank. Absolutely huge." Frank blinked agreement, wishing he could explain the strange certainty growing within him that this was just the beginning, that something fundamental had changed during those 3 days in the forest. "I should tell you," George continued, pulling himself together, "there have been some developments with Elaine." His expression darkened slightly. "She's been charged with attempted murder and elder abuse. Her initial court appearance is tomorrow. The prosecutor says it's an open and shut case, especially after her confession." Frank closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this information with complicated emotions. When he reopened them, George was watching him carefully. "I know this must be hard to hear," his friend said. 42 years of marriage and it ends like this. No one would blame you if you felt angry, betrayed." Frank blinked twice. "No. No?" George frowned. "You're not angry?" Another double blink. "I don't understand, Frank. She left you to die. If we hadn't found you, if that wolf hadn't somehow—" He stopped, struggling to comprehend. "How can you not be angry?" Frank wished desperately for his voice, for the ability to explain the complex swirl of emotions he felt toward Elaine. Not anger, but a profound sadness. Not hatred, but pity. He had seen her suffering alongside his own, watched her slowly crumble under the weight of caregiving without adequate support. Her actions were unforgivable, yes, but he understood the desperation that had driven her to them. Before he could attempt any rudimentary communication of these nuanced feelings, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside, raised voices, the sound of running feet. George turned toward the door just as a security guard rushed past, radio crackling with urgent instructions. "What the—" George began, moving to the window. He froze, staring down at something in the hospital parking lot. "I don't believe it." Frank felt a surge of anticipation, somehow knowing what George had spotted before his friend even spoke. "It's the wolf," George confirmed, voice hushed with amazement. "Right there in broad daylight, sitting at the edge of the woods behind the parking lot. Security's trying to clear the area, but it's not moving, just sitting there watching the building." A nurse appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless. "Mr. Miller, we're implementing security protocols due to wildlife on the premises. Please remain calm. Animal control has been notified." George turned from the window. "The wolf isn't threatening anyone," he protested. "It's just sitting there. Nevertheless, sir, it's hospital policy to secure all patients when potentially dangerous wildlife is reported," she replied, checking Frank's monitors before drawing the window blinds closed. After she left, George immediately reopened the blinds. "You should see this, Frank. It's like it knows you're here." Frank directed his gaze out the window. From his elevated position on the third floor, he could clearly see the commotion below. Hospital security personnel had formed a perimeter around the parking lot, keeping curious onlookers at a distance. Beyond them, at the tree line where the manicured hospital grounds gave way to natural woodland, sat the wolf, the same distinctive markings visible even from this distance. It was watching the building intently, ignoring the growing crowd of spectators. As Frank observed, a Park Service vehicle arrived and two uniformed rangers emerged, carrying what appeared to be tranquilizer rifles. "They're going to dart it," George said, concern evident in his voice. "Probably relocate it far from populated areas." Frank felt a surge of distress. The wolf had saved his life, had defied its own nature to protect him, and now faced capture for its loyalty. He made a sound, a strained, barely audible groan that represented his first voluntary vocalization in 2 years. George turned in surprise. "Frank, did you just—" Frank repeated the effort, managing a slightly louder sound while looking meaningfully from George to the window and back. "You're worried about the wolf," George interpreted. "You don't want them to capture it." An emphatic single blink. "I understand, but what can we do? It's creating a public safety concern by being here. If it won't leave on its own—" Frank's eyes darted to the window again, where the rangers were now cautiously approaching the wolf, weapons raised. The animal remained seated, watching the hospital with that same inexplicable focus, seemingly oblivious to the threat. In a surge of desperate will, Frank concentrated on his right arm. The tingling intensified, spreading from his fingertips up through his wrist. With monumental effort, he managed to raise his hand perhaps 2 inches off the bed, his first significant voluntary movement since the stroke. "Frank!" George exclaimed, witnessing the miracle. "My God!" Frank wasn't finished. He directed his raised hand toward the window, his intention clear even as the effort left him trembling with exertion. George understood immediately. "You want to go to the window. You want the wolf to see you." A single, emphatic blink. Without hesitation, George moved to the bed. "I don't know if this is allowed, but to hell with hospital regulations." He carefully disconnected Frank from the less essential monitoring equipment, leaving only the IV line intact, and maneuvered the bed closer to the window. "Can you do it again?" he asked. "Raise your hand where it might see you." Frank summoned his remaining strength, focusing all his will on that simple movement. His hand rose more steadily this time, fingertips pressing against the glass. Below, the wolf remained frozen in a standoff with the Rangers, who had stopped about 30 feet away, weapons trained but not yet fired. "It can't possibly see you from that distance," George murmured, though his tone lacked conviction. "It's 3 floors up and—" He broke off as the wolf suddenly stood, its attention shifting from the General Hospital building to their specific window. Its posture changed. Alert, tail raised slightly, head cocked in what seemed like recognition. "Impossible," George whispered. One of the Rangers took advantage of the wolf's apparent distraction, inching closer with tranquilizer gun raised. The animal noticed the movement and backed up several paces, still watching Frank's window. Then, with a final lingering look, it turned and loped into the forest, disappearing among the trees before the Rangers could get a clear shot. For several minutes, George and Frank remained at the window, watching as the Rangers conferred with hospital security and eventually departed, presumably to track the wolf. The crowd of spectators gradually dispersed, the excitement over. "It knew," George said finally, wheeling Frank's bed back to its original position. "Somehow it knew exactly where you were, and when it saw you were safe, it left." He shook his head in wonder. "I've hunted these mountains for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Frank let his hand fall back to the bed, exhausted but deeply satisfied. The wolf was safe, at least for now. And he had moved, really moved, for the first time in 2 years. As the day progressed, Frank's room became a hub of activity. The rehabilitation team arrived mid-morning, conducting a thorough assessment of his newfound motor function. Their findings confirmed what Frank already knew: something remarkable was happening. Small but significant movements were returning, primarily to his right side. The ability to slightly raise his hand, limited finger control, toe flexion, minimal facial movement. "It's not a complete recovery," the lead therapist cautioned, "but it's far more than we would typically expect after prolonged locked-in syndrome. With intensive rehabilitation, you might regain significant functionality." Dr. Williams returned with the neurological team, conducting additional tests and taking more samples. "We're still trying to understand the mechanism behind these changes," he explained. "Your blood work shows some unusual markers we haven't identified yet." Through it all, Frank remained calm, his mind focused on a single goal: regaining enough function to tell the wolf's story. Each small victory, pressing a call button, managing a weak thumbs-up gesture, represented progress toward that objective. Late in the afternoon, a new visitor arrived: Dr. Rachel Carter, the wildlife biologist George had mentioned. She was younger than Frank expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with sun-weathered skin and the practical attire of someone who spent more time in the field than in an office. "Mr. Miller," she greeted him, pulling up a chair, "I'm Dr. Carter from the National Park Service. I understand you had an extraordinary experience with a gray wolf during your ordeal." Frank blinked once, wishing he could express how inadequate that simple description was. "I've been tracking wolf populations in Monongahela for the past decade," she continued. "Based on the description, particularly the distinctive facial marking, I believe your companion may have been what we call Ghost, the alpha male of the northern pack." She showed Frank a photograph on her tablet. The image, captured by a remote wildlife camera, showed a large gray wolf with the same white facial patch and scar Frank remembered. "Is this the wolf that stayed with you?" she asked. Frank blinked once, confirming. "Remarkable. Ghost is normally extremely shy around humans. In 10 years of monitoring, we've only documented 3 direct sightings. She studied Frank with open curiosity. Yet he not only approached you, but apparently provided care and protection for multiple days. That's unprecedented behavior. Frank met her gaze steadily, trying to convey the depth of his experience through his eyes alone. "I'd like to record an interview, if that's acceptable," Dr. Carter said. "We can use your blinking system to answer yes/no questions. This could be important data for understanding wolf behavior and human-wildlife interactions." Frank agreed readily. For the next hour, he answered her methodical questions as best he could through the limited communication system. Was the wolf aggressive at any point? No. Did it bring food? Yes. Water? Yes. Did it display protective behavior? Emphatically, yes. The incident with the bear is particularly fascinating, Dr. Carter noted after Frank confirmed that encounter. Wolves typically avoid confrontation with larger predators unless defending their pack or territory. She leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "What's your theory, Mr. Miller? You spent your career observing wildlife behavior. Why would a wild wolf choose to protect a human in distress?" It was the question Frank had been waiting for, the one that required more than a simple yes or no response. With careful concentration, he raised his right hand and pointed to his own throat, then made a slashing motion across it. Dr. Carter frowned. "I'm not sure I understand." George, who had remained quietly in the corner during the interview, spoke up. "I think he's trying to say something about the wolf's scar." "Frank, are you referring to the mark across its eye?" Frank blinked once, then pointed to himself. "Doctor," Carter's eyes widened as she made the connection. "Are you suggesting you've encountered this wolf before? Perhaps treated it?" Another affirmative blink. "When? Recently?" 2 blinks. "No. Years ago?" 1 blink. This changes everything," Dr. Carter said, excitement evident in her voice. "If you treated an injured wolf that later recognized you, possibly even remembered your scent after years, that would explain its unusual behavior." She quickly checked her notes. Based on Ghost's estimated age, this would have been at least 8 to 10 years ago. "Does that time frame sound right?" Frank indicated no, then held up one hand with all 5 fingers extended, followed by the same gesture, repeated, signifying 15. 15 years ago? Dr. Carter clarified, receiving confirmation. "That's impossible. Gray wolves have an average lifespan of 6 to 8 years in the wild, 10 at most. Ghost can't be more than 8 or 9 based on our observations." Frank frowned, trying to reconcile this information with his vivid memory of the injured wolf cub. He pointed to the photo of Ghost on the tablet, then held his hand low to the ground, the universal sign for something small. "A cub?" George suggested. "Are you saying you helped a wolf cub 15 years ago?" Frank blinked yes. Dr. Carter's expression shifted from skepticism to dawning realization. "Not the same wolf?" she murmured. "But possibly related. Offspring, perhaps." She quickly swiped through files on her tablet. "We've documented that Ghost has distinctive white facial markings similar to his presumed mother, who we called Phantom. She disappeared from our monitoring about 3 years ago, likely deceased." She showed Frank another photo, this one grainier and obviously older, of a female wolf with similar white facial markings. "Could this be the wolf you helped? A female cub, approximately 15 years ago?" Frank studied the image carefully before blinking. Yes. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same distinctive white patch, though without the scar her offspring now carried. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Carter said, her professional composure slipping to reveal genuine excitement. "We've documented knowledge transfer in wolf packs, hunting techniques, territory awareness, but this suggests a multi-generational memory of a specific human interaction. Ghost's behavior toward you might represent learned recognition passed down from his mother. As the implications of this theory sank in, Frank felt a profound sense of wonder, not just at the wolf's behavior, but at the intricate connections that bound all living things, connections that transcended species barriers and stretched across generations. His simple act of compassion 15 years ago had created a ripple effect he could never have anticipated, one that ultimately saved his life when he needed it most. The interview concluded shortly after this revelation, with Dr. Carter promising to return with more questions once Frank's communication abilities improved. As she gathered her materials to leave, she paused at the door. "Mr. Miller, what happened between you and Ghost is already changing how we understand wolf cognition and behavior. But I think it might change how we understand ourselves, too." She smiled slightly. "The line between human and animal has always been blurrier than we like to admit." After she departed, George settled back in the visitor's chair with a heavy sigh. "Quite a day," he remarked. "Motor function returning, wolf mysteries solved, and all while you're supposed to be recovering." Frank's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," George continued, his tone growing serious. "Where you'll go after discharge. The doctors think you might be ready in a week or so, depending on your progress. You need specialized rehabilitation, obviously, and—" He hesitated. "You can't go back to the house, not with Elaine's situation and all that's happened." Frank had been considering this problem himself. The options were limited. A rehabilitation facility, likely followed by a nursing home, moving in with George, whose own health issues made long-term caregiving impractical, or some kind of assisted living arrangement, which would quickly deplete what remained of his savings. Before he could indicate any preference, George continued, "I may have a solution. My nephew's wife, Jennifer, you remember her, she's a physical therapist, has a small guest cottage on their property. It's just one bedroom, but it's all on ground level and could be adapted for your needs. They're offering it to you, at least until you're back on your feet, so to speak." Frank blinked once, touched by the generosity. "It's about 20 minutes from here, so you'd still have access to the hospital for ongoing treatment. And—" George smiled slightly. "It happens to be adjacent to the National Forest. About a half-mile from one of the wildlife corridors the Park Service established." The implication was clear, and Frank felt a surge of gratitude for his friend's understanding. The possibility of remaining near the forest, near where Ghost and his pack roamed, meant more to him than George could know. As evening approached, Frank's room quieted. George eventually departed, promising to return in the morning with more of Frank's personal items. The nursing staff completed their rounds, adjusting medications and checking vital signs with practiced efficiency. Left alone with his thoughts, Frank gazed out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere in those woods, Ghost had returned to his wild existence, hunting, patrolling territory, leading his pack. Their worlds had intersected briefly but profoundly, each forever changed by the encounter. Frank focused on his right hand, attempting the movement that had come so difficultly earlier that day. This time his fingers responded more readily, curling slightly toward his palm. Progress, small but unmistakable. The road ahead would be long and difficult. Physical therapy would be grueling. His legal and financial situations remained precarious. The betrayal by his wife had left emotional wounds that would take time to heal. Yet as he watched the first stars appear in the deepening blue of twilight, Frank felt something he had thought lost forever. Hope, not just for recovery, but for purpose. He would tell the wolf story. He would ensure that the remarkable bridge between species was understood and honored. With that resolution firm in his mind, Frank Miller, Ranger, survivor and witness to the extraordinary, closed his eyes and drifted into peaceful sleep, dreaming of forests and freedom and the golden eyes of a wolf who had chosen compassion over instinct. 10 days after his rescue, Frank sat in the courthouse hallway, the unfamiliar weight of a suit hanging loosely on his diminished frame. His wheelchair, a new high-tech model provided by the hospital's social services department, was positioned beside George, who alternated between nervous pacing and checking his watch. The hearing was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, and Frank's presence had been requested, though not required, by the district attorney. "You don't have to do this," George reminded him for perhaps the 5th time that morning. "No one would blame you for skipping it. Hell, the DA said your written statement would be enough." Frank shook his head slightly, a new movement he had mastered just 3 days earlier. The physical therapy sessions had been intense, pushing his recovering nervous system to its limits, but the results were undeniable. Limited head movement, improved finger dexterity, the first hints of facial expression returning. Most significantly, he could now produce rudimentary sounds, not words yet, but deliberate vocalizations that his speech therapist assured him were the first step toward potential verbal communication. "I know you feel you need to see her," George continued, settling back into the chair beside Frank. "I just worry it might set back your progress. You've been doing so well." Frank made a soft sound of disagreement. This wasn't about confrontation or closure, though the court-appointed psychiatrist had suggested both might be beneficial. This was about understanding. In the quiet hours of his hospital room, Frank had grappled with the reality of Elaine's actions, trying to reconcile the woman who had abandoned him with the woman he had loved for over 4 decades. The courthouse door opened and a tall, austere woman in a charcoal suit approached them. "Mr. Miller?" "I'm Andrea Wilcox, the prosecutor handling your wife's case." She extended her hand, then smoothly redirected the gesture to a gentle touch on his shoulder when she realized he couldn't reciprocate the handshake. "Thank you for coming today. Your presence will have a significant impact." Frank looked up at her questioningly. "The defense has accepted our plea deal," Miss Wilcox explained. "Mrs. Miller will plead guilty to attempted voluntary manslaughter, which carries a sentence of 5 to 10 years. Given her age and lack of prior criminal history, she'll likely serve the minimum. The elder abuse charges will be dropped as part of the agreement." Frank nodded slowly, processing this information. 5 years. Elaine would be 70 when released. The knowledge settled heavily in his chest, not satisfaction, but a complex ache for all they had lost, for the future neither of them would have. "There's something else you should know," the prosecutor continued, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "Mrs. Miller has been undergoing psychiatric evaluation. The preliminary diagnosis suggests severe depression compounded by caregiver burnout and complicated grief reaction relating to your daughter's death. This didn't influence the charges. Her actions were deliberate and premeditated, but it does provide some context." Again, Frank nodded. The diagnosis matched what he had observed during those final difficult months. Elaine's increasing withdrawal, her uncharacteristic outbursts, the emptiness in her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching. "The hearing will be brief," Ms. Wilcox continued. "The judge will confirm the plea, review the terms, and pronounce sentence. Mrs. Miller will have an opportunity to make a statement if she wishes. As the victim, you would normally have the same opportunity, but given your condition—" She trailed off delicately. Frank made a determined sound, reaching for the communication tablet that rested in his lap. His right index finger, now significantly more coordinated, pressed a sequence of icons. The synthesized voice was flat and mechanical, but the words were his. "I wish to speak through this device." Ms. Wilcox looked surprised, then nodded. "I'll inform the judge. It's unusual, but given the circumstances, I'm sure he'll allow it." As she walked away, George leaned closer. "Are you sure about this, Frank? What do you even want to say to her?" Frank didn't respond immediately. The truth was, he wasn't entirely certain himself. The words were still forming, still rising from the deep well of emotion he had been unable to express for so long. But he knew he needed this opportunity, not just for Elaine, but for himself. At precisely 10:00 a.m., they were ushered into the courtroom. It was smaller than Frank had imagined, with just a few rows of benches and a modest gallery that was mercifully empty, save for a court reporter and 2 sheriff's deputies. The proceedings were closed to the public and press at the request of both legal teams. Frank's wheelchair was positioned in a space reserved for victims and witnesses, providing a clear view of both the judge's bench and the defendant's table. George sat beside him, a steadying presence in the austere room. When the side door opened and Elaine entered, escorted by a female deputy, Frank felt his breath catch. She was diminished somehow, her normally erect posture hunched, her movements hesitant. The prison jumpsuit hung loosely on her frame, suggesting significant weight loss. Her hair, which she had always kept carefully colored and styled, showed several inches of gray roots. She didn't look at him as she took her place beside her attorney, a middle-aged man whose compassionate demeanor suggested a public defender rather than private counsel. Frank watched her profile, searching for glimpses of the woman he had married, the passionate teacher who had once filled their home with laughter and fierce debates about environmental policy. The proceedings moved quickly. Judge Reynolds, a stern-faced man in his 60s, confirmed the plea agreement, reviewed the charges, and addressed Elaine directly about her understanding of the consequences. Her responses were barely audible, single-word acknowledgments that seemed to require enormous effort. "Before I pronounce sentence," the judge said finally, "the defendant may make a statement. Mrs. Miller, do you wish to address the court?" Elaine's attorney leaned close, whispering something in her ear. She nodded faintly, then slowly rose to her feet. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice stronger than her previous responses. "I would like to speak." She turned slightly, her gaze directed not at the judge but at some middle distance, carefully avoiding Frank's position. "I have no excuse for what I did. I know that now. For a long time, I told myself I was being merciful, that Frank would be better off at peace than suffering as he was." Her voice cracked slightly. "But that wasn't my decision to make. It was fear, not mercy. Fear of watching him suffer. Fear of losing our home. Fear of spending my final years as nothing but a caretaker." She paused, visibly gathering herself. "I loved my husband for most of my life. I still do in the broken way I'm capable of love now. But something in me died when our daughter did. Something else withered during those long months of caregiving without help, without respite, without hope." Her hands gripped the table edge. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not even asking for understanding. I accept the consequences of my actions, and I will serve whatever sentence the court deems appropriate." With that, she sat down, shoulders slumping as though the brief statement had depleted her remaining strength. The judge nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller." He turned to Frank's position. "Mr. Miller, I understand you wish to make a statement as well. Through assistive technology, the court will accommodate this unusual circumstance. Please proceed when ready." All eyes turned to Frank. George squeezed his shoulder gently in encouragement as Frank focused on the tablet in his lap. The message he had laboriously composed that morning waited on the screen. With a deep breath, he pressed the icon to activate the synthesized voice. "Thank you, Your Honor," the mechanical voice began, eerily disembodied in the quiet courtroom. "I have had much time to think about what happened and why. For 2 years after my stroke, I was trapped in my own body, unable to move or speak but fully aware. I watched my wife struggle with the burden of my care. I saw her despair, her exhaustion. her slow collapse, under a weight she was never meant to carry alone. Frank paused, glancing up to see Elaine's head lift slightly, though she still didn't turn toward him. The synthesized voice continued, "When she left me in the forest, I understood her desperation, even as I feared for my life. Our system failed both of us, failed her as a caregiver with inadequate support, and failed me as a patient with limited options." Frank's finger moved to the next section of his prepared statement. "I do not condone what she did, but I do not hate her for it either. 42 years of marriage cannot be erased by one terrible act born of desperation and mental illness." Now Elaine did turn, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fragile hope as she finally met his gaze. "I ask the court to consider her mental state and the circumstances that led to her actions. I ask for compassion alongside justice, and I ask that she receive the mental health treatment she clearly needs during her incarceration." The final sentences were the hardest, the ones Frank had deliberated over most carefully. "Elaine and I have both been given second chances at life, hers through the justice system, mine through an extraordinary series of events in that forest. I intend to use my second chance wisely. I hope she will do the same." As the synthesized voice fell silent, the courtroom remained still. Judge Reynolds studied Frank thoughtfully, then shifted his gaze to Elaine, who had not looked away from her husband since he began speaking. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," the judge said finally. "Your compassion is noted and commendable." He straightened, assuming a more formal posture. "Having reviewed the plea agreement and heard from both parties, I accept the terms as presented. Eleanor Jean Miller, you are hereby sentenced to 6 years in the State Correctional Facility, with eligibility for parole after 5 years. He continued with the standard procedural details: court costs, victim restitution, terms of eventual release. But Frank was no longer fully listening. His focus remained on Elaine, on the silent communication passing between them. No words could adequately express the complicated emotions in that exchange. Regret, forgiveness, grief for what was lost, acknowledgement of what could never be restored. As the deputies approached to escort Elaine from the courtroom, she finally spoke directly to him. "I'm so sorry, Frank," she said, her voice breaking on his name. "For everything." Frank managed a small nod, all he could offer in that moment. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition of their shared humanity, their shared brokenness. After Elaine was led away, the courtroom slowly emptied. George helped navigate Frank's wheelchair through the narrow doorway and back into the corridor. "That was quite a statement," George said once they were alone in the courthouse elevator. "More gracious than most would manage in your position." Frank's finger found the simple response he'd programmed earlier. It was honest. Still, asking for compassion for her after what she did. George shook his head. "You're a better man than most, Frank Miller." Frank wasn't so sure about that. His statement hadn't been about moral superiority or even forgiveness in the traditional sense. It had been about truth. The complex, messy truth of their marriage, their struggles, and the system that had failed them both. Elaine would serve her sentence and he would continue his recovery. Their paths, intertwined for so long, had permanently diverged. The drive back to Riverside Memorial was quiet, both men lost in their own thoughts. Frank watched the familiar landscape roll past, the small businesses of Harper's Ferry, the winding road that followed the river, the dense forest that had nearly claimed his life and then, paradoxically, given it back to him. When they arrived at the hospital, Dr. Williams was waiting. His expression was serious but not grave, the face of a man with significant news to deliver. "Mr. Miller," he greeted them in the hospital lobby. "I'm glad you're back." We've completed the analysis of your most recent tests, and I'd like to discuss the results with you privately. Frank nodded, signaling George that it was okay for him to wait outside. As Dr. Williams wheeled him toward a consultation room, Frank felt a flicker of anxiety. The past 10 days had brought remarkable progress in his motor function, but he knew better than to expect miracles. Whatever improvements he had experienced, he was still a 68-year-old man with severe neurological damage. Inside the small room, Dr. Williams positioned Frank's wheelchair across from his own seat rather than behind the formal desk, a small courtesy that Frank appreciated. "First," the doctor began, "I want to acknowledge the extraordinary nature of your recovery thus far. The improvement in your motor function defies conventional medical understanding of locked-in syndrome." He opened a folder containing brain scan images. These latest images show continued neural activity in areas previously thought to be permanently damaged. It's minimal, but it's there. Frank nodded, having heard similar assessments in previous consultations. "What's new," Dr. Williams continued, "is our understanding of the potential mechanism." He leaned forward slightly. "Your blood work shows elevated levels of several growth factors associated with neural regeneration, substances our bodies naturally produce but usually in much smaller quantities. These factors are particularly concentrated in your cerebrospinal fluid." Frank frowned slightly, not understanding the significance. "In simple terms, Mr. Miller, your body appears to be repairing neural pathways that traditional medicine considers irreparable. The process is slow and partial, but it's happening, and we don't fully understand why." The doctor hesitated, clearly weighing his next words carefully. "There's been some unusual interest in your case from the research community, particularly since Dr. Carter shared her findings about your interaction with the wolf." Frank's frown deepened. He reached for his tablet, selecting a pre-programmed question. "What connection?" "Well, that's just it," Dr. Williams replied. "Several researchers have proposed a rather unorthodox theory. They've noted that wolf saliva contains compounds not found in domestic dogs, specific antimicrobial peptides and growth factors that help wounds heal more rapidly in the wild." Frank recalled the wolf's persistent attention to his face and hands during those days in the forest, the gentle licking that he had interpreted as affection or comfort, but might have served another purpose entirely. "To be clear," the doctor continued, "I'm not suggesting that wolf saliva cured your condition. That would be absurd. But the timing of your neurological improvements combined with these unusual blood markers—" He spread his hands. "Science often begins by observing correlations we don't yet understand." Frank considered this information carefully. The rational part of his mind recognized how improbable such a connection would be. Yet he had experienced something in that forest that transcended easy explanation. A bond with a wild creature that had saved his life through behaviors that defied natural instinct. "What does this mean for my recovery?" he asked through the tablet. "That's what I wanted to discuss," Dr. Williams replied. "Based on your progress, I believe you're an excellent candidate for an intensive neural rehabilitation program. It's new, experimental to some degree, but showing promising results for patients with similar injuries." He explained the details. 6 months of specialized therapy at a rehabilitation center in Baltimore, combining traditional physical therapy with emerging technologies designed to stimulate neural regeneration. The program was expensive, well beyond what Medicare would cover, but Dr. Williams had already arranged for Frank to be considered for a research grant that would fund his participation. "Given the unique aspects of your case, I believe you'll be accepted," the doctor concluded. "The team is particularly interested in monitoring your ongoing neural recovery while providing state-of-the-art rehabilitation." Frank absorbed this information, hope mingling with caution. He had learned through bitter experience not to expect too much, not to believe in miracles. Yet the evidence of his own body was undeniable. Movements returning where there had been none, sensations awakening after years of numbness. "There's one more thing," Dr. Williams added, his expression softening slightly. "The research team has expressed interest in studying the wolf as well, understanding its unusual behavior and potentially analyzing the compounds in its saliva. Dr. Carter mentioned this might be problematic from your perspective." Frank's response was immediate and firm, his fingers moving deliberately across the tablet. "The wolf remains wild, not to be captured or studied." Dr. Williams nodded, seeming unsurprised by this stance. "I thought you might feel that way. I've conveyed your position to the research team and they understand. Your participation in the program is not contingent on their access to the wolf." Relief washed through Frank. The thought of Ghost being captured, confined, and subjected to tests for human benefit was unbearable, a betrayal of the very creature that had preserved his life at risk to its own. "When would I start?" he asked through the tablet. "If you're accepted, which I expect you will be, the program begins in 2 weeks. You'd complete your current hospital stay, spend a few days at your temporary housing to settle in, then transfer to the rehabilitation center in Baltimore." Frank considered his options. The intensive program offered his best chance at meaningful recovery, at regaining enough function to live independently and perhaps even tell his story in his own voice someday. Yet the thought of leaving the area, of being separated from the forest and from Ghost, created a pang of loss he hadn't anticipated. "I need to think," his tablet voiced. "Of course," Dr. Williams agreed, rising. "Take a few days. Discuss it with Mr. Thompson. But I should tell you, opportunities like this don't come along often, especially for patients in your age group and with your complex medical history." After the doctor left, Frank sat alone in the consultation room, watching dust motes dance in the sunlight streaming through the window. His mind cycled through the implications of everything he had learned: the court hearing, Elaine's sentence, the mysterious physical changes in his own body, the rehabilitation opportunity, and the continued presence of Ghost near the hospital grounds, too much to process at once. Too many emotions competing for dominance: grief for his marriage, gratitude for his survival, hope for his recovery, concern for the wolf's well-being, and underneath it all, a strange sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before his stroke. When George returned to wheel him back to his room, Frank was quiet, lost in thought. He remained contemplative throughout the evening, responding to the nursing staff's questions and instructions, but volunteering nothing more. As night fell, he asked the night nurse to position his bed near the window, where he could see the forest edge beyond the parking lot. The request had become a nightly ritual since his admission, one the staff accommodated with knowing smiles. Under the gentle glow of the quarter moon, Frank watched the tree line. Most nights there was nothing to see, just the dark silhouettes of pines against the slightly lighter sky. But occasionally, if he was patient, he would glimpse a shadow moving parallel to the forest edge. Not approaching the hospital directly, but patrolling, observing from a distance. Tonight, as his eyes grew heavy with approaching sleep, he saw it. A gray form, substantial but flowing like liquid shadow along the boundary between wilderness and civilization. Ghost, maintaining his vigil. Waiting, perhaps, for Frank to return to the world they both belonged to, not the sterile confines of the hospital or the structured environment of a rehabilitation center, but the honest earth and ancient trees of the forest that had witnessed their improbable connection. "Soon," Frank whispered in his mind, a promise to both the wolf and himself. "I'll be back soon." As if hearing the unspoken thought, the wolf paused, turned toward the hospital, and stood motionless for a long moment before melting back into the darkness of the trees. In that brief connection across distance and species, Frank felt a renewal of the strange bond they shared, a reminder that some relationships transcended conventional understanding, existing in the liminal spaces between wild and tame, between healing and being healed. With that comforting thought, Frank Miller, once abandoned, now found, closed his eyes and surrendered to dreams of running through sunlit forests on legs that carried him swift and sure, a gray shadow keeping pace beside him. 3 months into his rehabilitation program at the Baltimore Neurological Recovery Center, Frank sat in the facility's sun-drenched atrium, watching raindrops trace erratic patterns down the glass ceiling. The weather matched his mood, unsettled, changeable, yet with moments of surprising clarity. His right hand, once completely paralyzed, now held a pen positioned over his journal. The words came slowly, his handwriting shaky but legible, another small victory in a journey marked by incremental progress and occasional setbacks. Day 94, he wrote, the date underlined twice. Spoke full sentence today. I want to go home. Dr. Patterson cried. Said it's the fastest vocal recovery she's seen in locked-in syndrome. Right leg responding to electrical stimulation. Stood for 40 seconds with parallel bars. He paused, tapping the pen against the paper as he considered what to add. The clinical details failed to capture the emotional reality of his recovery. The frustration of muscles that refused to obey, the triumph when they finally did, the bone-deep exhaustion that followed each therapy session. Most of all, they couldn't express the persistent pull he felt toward the mountains of West Virginia, toward the forest that haunted his dreams. 3 months away from the woods, he continued writing. Wonder if Ghost still waits. George's weekly updates had included reports of occasional wolf sightings near the hospital in Harper's Ferry, though these had grown less frequent as summer turned to fall. The wildlife researchers theorized that Ghost's pack had migrated to their winter territory in the higher elevations, a normal seasonal pattern. Yet Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing in his recovery, something the rehabilitation center with all its advanced technology couldn't provide. His reverie was interrupted by Dr. Leanne Patterson, the speech pathologist who had become his most steadfast ally in the rehabilitation program. She approached with her characteristic brisk energy, clipboard in hand, and determination in her stride. Writing again, I see, she observed, settling into the chair opposite him. That's excellent for your fine motor control. How's the hand feeling today? Frank set down his pen and flexed his fingers deliberately. Better, he said aloud, his voice a rasping whisper, but the word clearly formed, less tremor. Dr. Patterson beamed, her professional detachment momentarily overcome by genuine excitement. After 3 months of working together 5 days a week, she had become personally invested in his progress. That's 2 words with proper articulation. You're on a roll today, Mr. Miller. Frank, he corrected, the single syllable easier to manage than longer words. Frank, she acknowledged with a smile. Well, I have some news that might interest you. The research team is meeting tomorrow to evaluate your progress, and early indications are very positive. You've exceeded their recovery projections in multiple areas. He raised an eyebrow questioningly. They're considering approving a modified home-based continuation of your therapy, she explained. You would return to West Virginia with a comprehensive outpatient plan, specialized equipment, and regular visits from a local therapy team. Frank's heart quickened. When? He asked, the effort of speaking still requiring conscious concentration. If approved, perhaps within 2 weeks. She studied him carefully. This is what you want, isn't it? To go back? He nodded emphatically. Despite the excellent care and undeniable progress at the center, he had never stopped feeling like a transplant struggling to thrive in foreign soil. His recovery, remarkable as it was, felt incomplete, a medical success but a spiritual work in progress. I should caution you, Doctor, Patterson continued, that your progress might slow in a less controlled environment. The center provides optimal conditions for neurological recovery, consistent therapy, immediate medical supervision, specialized equipment. Understand, Frank replied, his voice strengthening with determination. But need home. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with his awareness of the trade-offs. There's something else you should know. A journalist from National Geographic has been inquiring about your case. Apparently, Dr. Carter from the Park Service mentioned your experience in a conference presentation about unusual wolf behaviors. It's generated quite a bit of interest in scientific circles. Frank frowned. He had anticipated media attention eventually, but had hoped for more time to recover enough to tell his own story in his own words, rather than have it filtered through others' interpretations. Not ready, he said simply. I've conveyed that to the administration, Doctor. Patterson assured him. Patient confidentiality protects you from any unwanted publicity. But eventually, if you're willing, your experience could provide valuable insights for both medical science and wildlife research. Frank nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. He had accepted the research grant with the understanding that his unusual case would contribute to scientific knowledge. Still, the thought of his profound, personal connection with ghosts being reduced to clinical analysis or sensationalized media coverage troubled him deeply. My story, he said with effort. Tell it, my way. Of course, she agreed. And at this rate of recovery, you'll be able to do exactly that before too long. She checked her watch and stood. We have hydrotherapy in 15 minutes. I'll meet you in the pool area. After she departed, Frank returned to his journal, adding a final line. Going home soon. We'll find you, old friend. 2 weeks later, a specially equipped van navigated the winding roads of rural West Virginia, carrying Frank back to the landscape that had both nearly claimed his life and mysteriously restored it. George drove, occasionally glancing at his friend in the rearview mirror. Frank sat secured in his advanced wheelchair, watching the familiar scenery with undisguised emotion. Nearly there, George announced as they turned onto a narrow gravel drive. Jennifer's been getting the cottage ready all week. You'd think the president was coming to visit. The cottage came into view, a modest one-story structure with a newly installed wheelchair ramp and an expansive deck overlooking a sloping meadow that ended at the forest edge. It was perfect, accessible yet private, civilized yet close to wilderness. Jennifer Thompson, George's niece by marriage, waited on the porch. A physical therapist by training, she had volunteered to oversee Frank's home care program, coordinating with the medical team from Harper's Ferry Hospital who would make regular visits. Welcome home, Frank, she called as George parked the van. Or should I say, welcome to your new home. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity, luggage unloaded, medical equipment installed, care schedules reviewed. The cottage had been thoughtfully modified for Frank's needs. Widened doorways, an accessible bathroom with grab bars, a hospital-grade bed in the bedroom, and a specialized computer system with voice recognition software. When everything was finally arranged to Jennifer's satisfaction, she and George left Frank alone to rest, promising to return with dinner later. The sudden silence was a relief after months of institutional living. No beeping monitors, no intercom announcements, no constant presence of medical staff. Frank maneuvered his wheelchair to the deck doors, which Jennifer had left open to admit the crisp October air. From here, he could see the rolling meadow sloping down to the tree line perhaps 200 yards away. Beyond lay the vast expanse of Monongahela National Forest. Not the exact location where he had been abandoned, but the same interconnected wilderness. Using the wheelchair's controls, he navigated onto the deck and positioned himself at the railing. The afternoon sun warmed his face as he breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. After months of filtered air and antiseptic surroundings, the sensory richness was almost overwhelming. Frank's gaze remained fixed on the forest edge as daylight began to fade. There was no logical reason to expect Ghost to appear. The wolf pack's territory likely extended miles from this location, and they would be focused on preparing for the approaching winter. Yet he watched, hope mingling with reason in the quiet of approaching evening. As shadows lengthened across the meadow, Frank began the laborious process of vocalization exercises Dr. Patterson had prescribed. Simple sounds at first, vowels and basic consonants, progressing to short words. His voice, gaining strength daily, carried across the open space. Ah, e, o, ha, home, help, here. The deliberate practice continued for nearly 20 minutes until fatigue made precision impossible. As he finished, the last word, here, seemed to hang in the air, an announcement and an invitation. Frank was about to turn his wheelchair back toward the cottage when movement at the forest edge caught his attention. He froze, eyes straining in the diminishing light. There, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the trees. Large, four-legged, moving with deliberate caution along the boundary between forest and meadow. His heart rate quickened as the figure emerged more clearly into the open, a wolf, gray with distinctive facial markings visible even at this distance. Ghost. Frank gripped the wheelchair arms, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion too complex to name. After 3 months, after miles of separation, the wolf had found him again. Whether through extraordinary coincidence or some deeper connection neither science nor rational thought could explain, Ghost was here. The wolf paused at the meadow's edge, head raised, clearly scenting the air. Though too distant to see clearly, Frank felt the animal's gaze find him on the deck. For long moments, they regarded each other across the expanse of open ground, man and wolf, each changed by their shared experience, each existing now in a liminal space between their natural worlds. Then, with deliberate slowness, Ghost lowered himself to the ground at the forest edge, not approaching further, but not retreating either. Watching, waiting, present. Ghost, Frank whispered, the name emerging more clearly than any word he had spoken since his stroke. You found me. The wolf's ears twitched forward as if catching the faint sound across the distance. Then, in a response that sent chills down Frank's spine, Ghost raised his muzzle and released a single, haunting howl that echoed across the meadow. The sound hung in the twilight air, not a full-throated call to a pack, but a focused communication, an acknowledgement. When the sound faded, Ghost remained at his post, settling into what appeared to be a comfortable position for extended observation. Frank, understanding the message in this behavior, felt tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying release from his shoulders. The wolf wasn't leaving. Whatever inexplicable bond had formed between them in those desperate days in the forest remained intact. Later that evening, when George and Jennifer returned with dinner, they found Frank still on the deck, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, his gaze fixed on the darkened forest edge. "Frank, everything okay?" George asked, concerned by his friend's prolonged exposure to the cooling air. "Yes," Frank replied, his voice stronger and clearer than they had yet heard it. "Ghost is here." George moved to the railing, squinting into the darkness. "The wolf? Here? Are you sure?" Frank nodded. Forest edge. Watching. Jennifer joined them, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Should we be worried? I mean, if there's a wolf near the property." "No danger," Frank assured her, the words coming slowly but distinctly. Just reconnecting. George studied his friend's face in the dim light spilling from the cottage. The peace he saw there, the quiet certainty, convinced him more than any explanation could have. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "That animal really does have some kind of connection with you." As the days passed, a routine developed. Ghost would appear at the forest edge each evening around dusk, sometimes remaining visible for hours, sometimes just making a brief appearance before melting back into the trees. He never approached the cottage directly, but maintained his vigilant presence at a respectful distance. Frank's recovery continued its remarkable trajectory. The local medical team expressed astonishment at his progress, particularly his rapidly improving speech, which exceeded all projections based on his type of neurological damage. By the end of the first month, he could form complete, if simple, sentences. By the 6th week, he had begun using a walker for short distances under Jennifer's supervision. Dr. Carter from the Park Service visited regularly, documenting Ghost's unusual behavior for her research while respecting Frank's insistence that the wolf remain undisturbed. Their conversations, initially halting due to Frank's speech limitations, grew increasingly fluid as his vocal abilities strengthened. "In all my years studying wolf behavior, I've never seen anything like this," she admitted during one visit, watching Ghost through binoculars from the deck. "He's essentially maintaining a territory boundary that includes your residence. The GPS collar data from other pack members shows they're primarily ranging 5 miles north. But Ghost makes this journey regularly, alone." "He's keeping his promise," Frank said simply. Dr. Carter lowered her binoculars, regarding him curiously. What promise would that be? Frank considered how to explain something he felt but couldn't fully articulate. The wordless covenant that had formed between human and wolf during those desperate days in the forest. "To protect," he said finally. "To watch over, just as I protected his mother years ago." She nodded thoughtfully. "Reciprocity is observed in many species, though rarely between different species and almost never sustained over time like this." She hesitated, then added, "The scientific papers I could publish on this case would make my career, but I find myself reluctant to reduce what's happening here to data points and behavioral analyses." "Some things beyond science," Frank agreed, grateful for her understanding. "That said," she continued, "there's growing interest in your story. That National Geographic journalist is particularly persistent. Have you given more thought to sharing your experience?" Frank had in fact been contemplating this question with increasing frequency. His speech therapist had suggested that narrating his story could provide excellent cognitive and verbal exercise. More importantly, he felt a responsibility to ensure that what had happened was understood in its proper context, not as a sensationalized tale of animal behavior or medical miracle, but as a profound intersection of compassion, memory, and the complex bonds that could form between all living beings. "Soon," he told her, "when I can tell it properly." As fall deepened toward winter, Frank's progress accelerated. His voice gained strength and clarity, though it retained a slight raspiness that doctors suggested might be permanent. His right side continued improving dramatically, while his left showed more modest gains. He could now walk short distances with a cane, though the wheelchair remained necessary for longer periods of activity. Throughout this physical transformation, Ghost maintained his evening vigil. Sometimes Frank would sit on the deck bundled against the increasing cold, speaking softly to the distant wolf. Other times he would simply acknowledge the animal's presence with a raised hand, a gesture Ghost seemed to recognize, occasionally responding with a brief howl before disappearing into the forest. Their unusual connection did not go unnoticed. Word spread through the local community, then beyond. Amateur photographers began appearing at the edges of the property, hoping to capture images of the miracle wolf that had reportedly saved a man's life. Park rangers increased patrols to protect both the wolf and Frank's privacy. The situation came to a head in early December when Frank discovered a wildlife photographer with a telephoto lens positioned at the edge of the meadow. The intrusion sparked an uncharacteristic anger in him, not just for the violation of his privacy but for the potential disturbance to Ghost's routine. That evening, after Jennifer helped him place a series of calls, Frank made a decision. If his story was going to be told, he would control the narrative. He would protect Ghost while honoring the truth of their extraordinary bond. The journalist from National Geographic, Catherine Delaney, arrived the following week during a light snowfall that transformed the landscape into a winter postcard. She was younger than Frank had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent significant time outdoors and an air of respectful curiosity rather than sensationalistic hunger. "Thank you for finally agreeing to speak with me, Mr. Miller," she said as they settled in the cottage's small living room. "I've been following your story since Dr. Carter's presentation last summer." "Frank, please," he corrected, his speech measured but clear. "And I should thank you for your patience." Catherine smiled, arranging her recording equipment on the coffee table between them. "Good stories are worth waiting for. And yours is, well, extraordinary doesn't quite cover it. That's why I need to tell it carefully," Frank explained. "Not just what happened, but why it matters." "I understand completely," she assured him. "That's why I proposed a feature article rather than a brief news piece. This isn't just about an unusual animal behavior or a medical recovery. It's about something deeper, something that challenges how we think about the boundaries between humans and wildlife." Frank nodded, appreciating her insight. "Exactly." For the next 3 hours, Frank shared his story, beginning not with Elaine's betrayal, but with the long-ago rescue of a wolf cub from an illegal trap. He described his career as a ranger, his deep connection to the forest, the stroke that had imprisoned him within his own body, and the desperate circumstances that had led to his abandonment. His voice occasionally faltered when recounting particularly emotional moments, but Catherine waited patiently, never rushing or interrupting. When he described those first critical hours with Ghost, the wolf's careful inspection, its efforts to provide water and warmth, its protection against the bear, Catherine's professional demeanor slipped, revealing genuine amazement. "And you believe this wolf is the offspring of the cub you rescued years ago?" she clarified. "DNA testing confirmed it," Frank replied, referencing the samples Dr. Carter had non-invasively collected from Ghost's territory. "The genetic markers match, what they call lineal descent, from the female wolf I helped. So, Ghost, that's what you call him, was essentially returning a favor that you had done for his mother years before he was even born?" Frank considered this simplified interpretation. Perhaps. Or perhaps something more complex. Wolves pass knowledge through generations, hunting techniques, territory awareness, danger recognition. Maybe they also pass recognition of allies. As the interview continued, Frank guided the conversation away from mere sensationalism toward the deeper implications of his experience, the failings of the healthcare system that had left Elaine desperate and alone in her caregiving role, the remarkable neural regeneration that continued to puzzle his doctors, and most importantly, the profound connection between human and wild animal that defied easy scientific explanation. "Ghost is not a pet," he emphasized, "not domesticated. He remains wild, a predator, pack leader. What happened between us wasn't a miracle or fantasy. It was a choice, a wild animal choosing compassion over instinct." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "That's the heart of the story, isn't it?" Not just that you survived against impossible odds, but that your survival challenges our fundamental assumptions about the divide between humans and wildlife. Exactly, Frank agreed, relieved by her understanding. That's why I'm telling this story now, not for attention, but because people need to know that the lines we draw between species are more permeable than we think. As evening approached, Frank suggested they move to the deck. Ghost usually appears go at dusk, he explained. You should see him. Complete the story. Bundled against the December chill, they settled on the covered portion of the deck. Jennifer brought hot coffee before discreetly retreating, leaving them to wait in comfortable silence as the snow continued its gentle descent. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked eventually. "After the article is published, you'll likely receive even more attention. Interview requests, perhaps book offers." Frank gazed at the forest edge, already growing indistinct in the early winter twilight. "Continue healing," he said simply. "Walk on my own again. Maybe return to the forest, eventually." "And Ghost, do you think this unusual relationship will continue?" "For as long as he chooses," Frank replied. "He's wild, free to stay, or go. That's important to remember." As if summoned by their conversation, a gray shape materialized at the meadow's edge. Ghost emerged from the trees, more visible than usual against the snow-covered ground. He paused, scenting the air, perhaps detecting the unfamiliar presence on the deck. "There," Frank said softly, indicating with a slight gesture. "That's him." Catherine raised her camera, adjusting the lens for the fading light. "Magnificent," she whispered. "He's absolutely magnificent." The wolf stood motionless, evaluating the situation. For a moment, Frank feared he might retreat, uncomfortable with the stranger's presence. Instead, after his assessment, Ghost settled into his customary position, amber eyes fixed on the cottage. "He's comfortable with you here," Frank observed. "Unusual, normally very cautious with strangers." "I'm honored," Catherine said, sincerely, lowering her camera after taking just a few discreet photos. "And I understand now, seeing him, why you've been so protective. This isn't just a good story, it's a sacred trust." As darkness fell completely, Ghost remained at his post, a guardian shadow at the threshold between wilderness and civilization. Frank watched him with the deep contentment of someone who had found unexpected purpose in tragedy, redemption in abandonment, and connection in the most unlikely of places. "This is the real story," he told Catherine quietly. "Not just survival, but transformation. Ghost saved more than my life in that forest. He reminded me that boundaries we create are often illusions." Later, after Catherine had departed with promises to share the article draft before publication, Frank remained on the deck alone. The temperature had dropped further, but he was reluctant to return indoors while Ghost maintained his vigilant presence. "Thank you," he called softly across the snowy expanse, his voice carrying in the still night air. "For everything." As if in response, Ghost raised his head and released a single clear howl that echoed across the meadow, a sound that seemed to bridge the distance between them, between past and present, between abandonment and belonging. In that moment, Frank Miller understood with perfect clarity that he had not merely survived his ordeal in the forest, he had been transformed by it. And in that transformation lay not just his personal healing, but a profound truth about the interconnectedness of all living things, a truth he would spend the rest of his recovered life honoring and sharing with a world that desperately needed to hear it. Spring arrived in the mountains of West Virginia with a gentle insistence, coaxing pale green buds from winter-bare branches and drawing early wildflowers through the thawing forest floor. 6 months had passed since Frank's return from the rehabilitation center, and the changes in his condition mirrored the seasonal transformation of the landscape around him. The cottage deck, his favorite observation point, had been modified with a comfortable outdoor recliner where he now sat, enjoying the late afternoon sunshine. A cane rested against the railing nearby, still necessary for longer walks but increasingly relegated to a supportive role rather than an essential one. Most remarkably, the wheelchair that had dominated his existence for so long now remained folded in a closet used only on his most fatigued days. "Mail's here!" Jennifer called, stepping onto the deck with a stack of envelopes and a glossy magazine, including your copies of National Geographic. Frank accepted the magazine with a surge of anticipation. Though he had reviewed and approved the article weeks ago, seeing the final published version, his story, their story, presented to the world, felt momentous. "Thanks," he said, his voice now carrying the natural cadence of normal speech, though still with the slight rasp doctors confirmed would likely be permanent. "Any word from George? He called while you were napping. Said he'll be by tomorrow with that fishing gear he promised." Jennifer smiled, knowing how much Frank was looking forward to attempting his first fishing expedition since the stroke. "Need anything else before I head out?" Frank shook his head. "I'm all set. The dinner you left in the fridge looks perfect." After Jennifer departed, Frank turned his attention to the magazine. The cover featured a striking image of Ghost at the forest edge, amber eyes luminous against his silver-gray fur, with the headline, "The Wolf Who Remembered, an Extraordinary Tale of Cross-Species Compassion." He opened to the feature article, immediately struck by the double-page spread that introduced the story. A professional photograph of Frank standing at the edge of the meadow with his cane, looking toward the forest, juxtaposed with a smaller image of him in the hospital bed shortly after his rescue. The contrast was stark, a visual representation of his remarkable journey. Catherine Delaney's writing was everything he had hoped for: thoughtful, nuanced, scientifically grounded, yet respectful of the emotional and even spiritual dimensions of his experience. She had captured not just the dramatic narrative of his abandonment and rescue, but the deeper significance of what had occurred between man and wolf. "What happened in those woods," she wrote, "challenges our fundamental understanding of wildlife behavior and interspecies relationships." Frank Miller's extraordinary bond with the wolf he calls Ghost, confirmed through DNA testing to be the offspring of a wolf cub Miller once rescued, suggests that the boundaries we draw between human and animal consciousness may be more permeable than science has traditionally acknowledged. The article included interviews with Dr. Carter from the Park Service, discussing the unprecedented nature of Ghost's behavior from a wildlife biology perspective. Frank's doctors provided medical context for his improbable recovery, careful to emphasize that while his progress defied typical outcomes for locked-in syndrome, it remained within the realm of recognized neurological phenomena rather than miraculous healing. Most gratifying was Catherine's treatment of Elaine's role in the story. Rather than vilifying her as a monster, the article contextualized her actions within the broader crisis of caregiver burnout and inadequate support systems for families dealing with catastrophic illness. "The tragedy that nearly ended Frank Miller's life," Catherine wrote, "began not with malice, but with the collapse of support systems that left his wife, Elaine, drowning in caregiver responsibilities, medical debt, and untreated depression. While her actions cannot be condoned, they highlight a systemic failure that leaves countless families in similar desperate circumstances." Frank read the entire article twice, emotions shifting between pride, gratitude, and a lingering sadness for all that had been lost along the way to this new chapter of his life. When he finally set the magazine aside, the sun was sinking toward the western ridgeline, casting long shadows across the meadow. Right on schedule, movement at the forest edge caught his attention. Ghost emerged from the trees with his characteristic cautious grace, pausing to scent the air before settling into his now familiar observation position. The wolf's visits had maintained their remarkable consistency throughout the changing seasons. Weather made no difference. Ghost appeared through snow, rain, and unseasonable heat with the reliability of a natural law rather than the caprice of a wild animal. Only the timing varied slightly with the shifting daylight hours. Frank raised his hand in their established greeting, and Ghost's ears pricked forward in acknowledgement. This silent communication, maintained across the meadow's expanse, had become a cherished ritual for both man and wolf, a daily reaffirmation of their unlikely bond. Today, however, Frank felt a restlessness that had been growing within him for weeks. His improving mobility had awakened a deep yearning to return to the forest, not just to observe it from a distance, but to immerse himself in its presence as he had throughout his life before the stroke. His physical therapist had cautiously approved short nature walks on level ground, but Frank's ambitions extended further. He glanced at his cane, then back at Ghost, still watching from the forest boundary. The distance between them, perhaps 200 yards of gently sloping meadow, represented a physical challenge far beyond anything he had attempted in his rehabilitation, yet the pull was undeniable, almost primal in its intensity. "Today," Frank said aloud, the decision crystallizing in the moment of its utterance. He reached for his cane and carefully rose from the recliner, taking a moment to find his balance. The late afternoon air carried the scent of warming earth and new growth, the perfume of a forest awakening from winter dormancy. Ghost remained motionless at the tree line, watching with that unnerving intelligence as Frank took his first tentative steps toward the edge of the deck. The meadow path was clear and relatively even, regularly maintained by George and occasionally used by Jennifer during her morning runs. Still, it presented numerous challenges for someone with Frank's limited mobility: slight depressions, patches of uneven ground, the consistent downward slope. Under normal circumstances, he would have waited for assistance, used his wheelchair, or simply admired the view from the safety of the deck. But these were not normal circumstances, and Frank Miller was no longer the same man who had once been abandoned in the forest. His first steps onto the meadow path were cautious, each placement of the cane deliberate and testing. His left leg, still significantly weaker than his right, dragged slightly with each forward movement. Yet there was a determination in his slow progress that transformed the awkward gait into something purposeful, even dignified. Ghost watched this gradual approach without moving, his posture alert but relaxed. As Frank made his way down the gentle slope, pausing occasionally to rest and catch his breath, the wolf's ears remained fixed forward, tracking his halting progress. The journey that would have taken a healthy person 2 minutes stretched into nearly 20. Sweat beaded on Frank's forehead despite the cool air, and his left hand trembled with the effort of maintaining his balance. Yet he continued, driven by something beyond mere physical determination, a need to close the distance that had separated him from both the forest he loved and the creature that had saved his life within it. About halfway across the meadow, Frank's left leg buckled unexpectedly. He stumbled, the cane sliding on a patch of damp earth, and for a heart-stopping moment he feared he would fall. His arms windmilled as he fought to regain balance, muscles straining against the pull of gravity. In that moment of crisis, Ghost moved. The wolf left his position at the forest edge and loped swiftly across the remaining distance, covering ground with efficient grace that contrasted sharply with Frank's labored progress. He stopped several yards away, watching intently as Frank regained his stability. "I'm okay," Frank said breathlessly, though whether to reassure himself or the wolf he wasn't certain. Ghost circled him once, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly evaluating his condition. The behavior echoed their first encounter in the forest, the same careful assessment, the same intelligent consideration. When Frank straightened and adjusted his grip on the cane, the wolf seemed satisfied, backing up several paces, but remaining nearby rather than returning to his usual position. "Thank you," Frank said softly. "But I need to do this myself." As if understanding, Ghost retreated a few more steps, then simply paced alongside as Frank resumed his careful journey toward the forest edge. The wolf matched his painfully slow cadence, occasionally stopping when Frank needed to rest, maintaining a parallel course about 10 feet to his right. By the time they reached the tree line, the sun had dropped below the western ridge, casting the forest in deepening shadow. Frank paused at the threshold where meadow gave way to woodland, leaning heavily on his cane as he caught his breath. Ghost stopped as well, watching him with those amber eyes that seemed to hold questions no human language could fully address. "I made it," Frank said, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "Didn't think I could, but I did." The achievement might have seemed modest to an outside observer, a man walking across a meadow, reaching a forest edge. But for Frank it represented a reclaiming of territory, both physical and symbolic. He had returned, under his own power, to the wilderness that had nearly claimed his life, and then inexplicably given it back. Ghost approached closer now, circling once more before sitting directly in front of Frank, perhaps 5 feet away, the closest the wolf had ever voluntarily come since those desperate days after his abandonment. In the fading light, the animal's features were more distinct, the white facial marking bisected by the old scar, the silvered fur around his muzzle suggesting he had aged since their first encounter, the intelligent eyes that regarded Frank with what could only be described as recognition. "Hello, old friend," Frank said quietly. "It's been a long journey for both of us." He carefully lowered himself to sit on a fallen log at the forest edge, resting his cane across his knees. Ghost remained where he was, seemingly content to share this moment of quiet communion as twilight deepened around them. For several minutes, they simply existed together in the hushed boundary between meadow and forest. No human words could have adequately expressed what passed between them, a wordless understanding that transcended the conventional boundaries of species. In that silence, Frank felt a sense of completion, of having closed a circle that had opened in the moment of his abandonment. Eventually he became aware of the deepening darkness and the cooling air. "I should head back," he said reluctantly. "Not sure I can make it in the dark." As if on cue, lights flicked on at the cottage, Jennifer returning, probably concerned by his absence from the deck. The yellow glow spilled across the meadow, providing at least some illumination for his return journey. With effort, Frank used his cane to push himself back to his feet. The exertion of the outward journey had depleted his strength, and he knew the uphill return would be even more challenging. Ghost seemed to sense his concern, rising and taking a position slightly ahead of him, almost as if indicating the way. "Leading me home?" Frank asked with a tired smile. "Like old times?" The return journey was indeed more difficult. Frank's muscles, already taxed beyond their usual limits, protested each step up the gentle slope. Twice he had to stop and rest, sitting directly on the ground because he lacked the strength to lower himself more gracefully. Each time, Ghost waited patiently, never approaching too closely but maintaining a vigilant presence. Jennifer spotted them when they were about halfway back. She came running down the path, fear and relief mingling in her expression. "Frank, what on earth are you doing out here alone?" "It's getting dark, and you could have fallen—" She broke off abruptly as she noticed Ghost, who had retreated several yards at her approach but remained visible in the dimming light. "Oh my God! The wolf! Are you—" "I'm fine," Frank assured her, accepting her supportive arm with gratitude. "Just took a walk to the forest edge. Ghost kept me company." Jennifer glanced nervously at the wolf, who was watching them with alert caution. "Ghost has never come this close to the house before." He was making sure I got back safely, Frank explained, knowing how improbable it sounded, yet certain of its truth. He's not a threat, Jennifer. He never has been. With her assistance, the remainder of the journey back to the cottage proceeded more quickly. Ghost followed at a distance, maintaining his watchful presence until they reached the deck steps. There he stopped, sitting at the edge of the floodlit area surrounding the cottage. Once Frank was settled safely inside, Jennifer brought him water and his evening medications, her expression still troubled. "You shouldn't have gone so far alone," she admonished gently. "What if you had fallen? What if your leg had given out completely?" "I wasn't alone," Frank replied simply. She glanced out the window to where Ghost could still be seen at the periphery of the light. That's not exactly the kind of supervision your doctors had in mind." Frank smiled, too tired to debate the point. "Probably not," he conceded. "But it was important. I needed to reach the forest again. To complete the circle." Jennifer's expression softened with understanding. During the months of caring for him, she had come to recognize the profound significance the forest held in his recovery. Not just as a physical location, but as a symbol of his journey from helplessness to renewed independence. "Just promise you'll take me with you next time," she said, squeezing his shoulder gently. "Heart attacks aren't included in my caregiving contract." After she left for the evening, Frank moved to the living room window that overlooked the meadow. Ghost had retreated to his usual position at the forest edge, a distant silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. Yet Frank felt a shift in their connection. A progression from the strange guardian-ward relationship that had defined their early interactions to something more balanced, more equal. Today, they had walked together, neither leading nor following, but moving in parallel through a shared landscape. It was, Frank reflected, perhaps the most natural expression of their unusual bond. Two beings with their own separate lives and natures, intersecting in moments of mutual recognition and respect. The National Geographic article lay open on the side table, Catherine's words capturing part of this truth. In a world increasingly defined by human dominance and technological separation from nature, Frank Miller's experience offers a humbling reminder. Sometimes, the deepest healing comes not from medical science, but from reconnection with the wild world from which we emerged. Frank's gaze returned to the distant silhouette of Ghost at the forest edge. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: continued physical therapy, an interview with a local newspaper, preparations for his tentative return to public speaking about conservation issues. His life was filling again with purpose and connection after the isolated years of his illness. Yet no matter how busy his days became, he would maintain this evening ritual, this quiet acknowledgement of the extraordinary bond that had given him a second chance at life. And somewhere in the ancient wilderness beyond the meadow, a wolf with unusual white facial markings would continue his own existence, leading his pack, hunting, surviving, occasionally remembering the human whose life had become inexplicably intertwined with his own. As Frank finally turned away from the window to prepare for bed, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The journey of recovery, both physical and spiritual, would continue. There would be setbacks and achievements, moments of frustration and breakthrough, but he would never again feel truly abandoned, not with the knowledge that connections could form in the most unexpected places, bridging the supposed divides between species, between wild and tame, between hopelessness and healing. In the quiet dark of night, as Frank drifted toward sleep, he sent a final thought toward the forest and the watchful presence he knew remained there. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for showing me the way home. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the meadow, a wolf howled once, a sound that carried through the spring night like a response, like a promise, like a reminder that some bonds, once formed, transcend all conventional understanding. In that haunting call echoed the truth Frank had discovered in his extraordinary journey, that sometimes, in our most desperate moments of abandonment, salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, teaching us that we are never truly alone in this wild, interconnected world. In the twilight of life, when abandonment feels most bitter and health challenges most daunting, remember Frank Miller's extraordinary journey. Like many of us facing our golden years with uncertainty, Frank discovered that healing often comes from unexpected sources, even from the wild. His story reminds us that our worst moments don't define us. They can be the beginning of our most profound connections. When Elaine left Frank in that forest, it seemed like the end. Instead, it became a doorway to a new chapter filled with purpose and unexpected bonds. Many of us know the sting of betrayal, the fear of dependency, or the grief of lost abilities. Yet Frank's journey shows that even when traditional support systems fail, the universe can provide companions in the most surprising forms. His path from paralysis to walking the forest edge again wasn't just physical rehabilitation, it was spiritual restoration. What forest edge are you longing to reach? What wild connection might be waiting to guide you home? Share your story of unexpected healing in the comments. Has an animal or nature ever provided comfort when humans couldn't? We'd love to hear how you found hope in unexpected places during your most challenging moments.